Chapter 7. Campaign against the Malians, continued. After dining and causing his men to rest until the first watch of the night, Alexander marched forward, and traveling a great distance through the night, he arrived at the river Hydraiots at daybreak. There he ascertained that most of the Malians had already crossed the river, but coming upon those who were still in the act of crossing, he slew many of them in their passage. Having crossed with them in pursuit without any delay by the same ford, he kept close up with those who had outstripped him in their retreat. Many also of these he slew, some he took prisoners, but the majority of them escaped into a place strong by nature and made more so by fortifications. When the infantry reached him, Alexander dispatched Python against the men in the fortress, giving him the command of his own brigade of infantry and 2 regiments of cavalry. These, attacking the place, took it at the first assault, and made slaves of all those who had fled thither for safety, at least as many of them as had not perished in the attack. After accomplishing this, Python returned again to the camp. Alexander in person led his forces against a certain city of the Brachmans, because he ascertained that some of the Malians had fled for refuge into it. When he reached it, he led his phalanx in serried ranks close up to the wall on all sides. The enemy, seeing that their walls were being undermined, and being themselves repulsed by the missiles, abandoned the walls, and having fled for safety into the citadel, began to defend themselves from thence. A few Macedonians having rushed in with them, turning round and drawing together into a close body, drove some of them back and killed 25 of them in their retreat. Hereupon Alexander ordered the scaling ladders to be placed against the citadel on all sides, and the wall to be undermined. And when one of the towers, being undermined, fell down, and a part of the wall between 2 towers was breached, and thus rendered the citadel more accessible to assault in this quarter, he was seen to be the first man to scale the wall and get hold of it. The other Macedonians, seeing him, were ashamed of themselves, and mounted the ladders in various places. The citadel was soon in their possession. Some of the Indians began to set fire to the houses, and being caught in them were killed, but most of them were slain fighting. About 5,000 in all were killed, and on account of their valor, only a few were taken prisoners. Chapter 8. Defeat of the Malians at the river Hydraiots. Having remained there one day to give his army rest, he advanced on the morrow against the other Malians. He found the cities abandoned, and ascertained that the men had fled into the desert. There he again gave the army 1 day's rest, and on the next day sent Python and Demetrius the cavalry general back to the river, in command of their own troops, giving them in addition as many battalions of the light-armed infantry as were sufficient for the enterprise. Their instructions were to go along the bank of the river, and if they met any of those who had fled for safety into the woods, of which there were many near the river's bank, to kill all who refused to surrender. Python and Demetrius captured many of these in the woods and killed them. He himself led his forces against the largest city of the Malians, whither he was informed many from the other cities had taken refuge. But this also the Indians abandoned when they heard that Alexander was marching against it. Crossing the river Hydraiots, they remained with their forces drawn up upon its bank, because it was high, and they thought they could obstruct Alexander's passage. When he heard this, he took all the cavalry which he had with him, and went to the part of the river where he was informed that the Malians had drawn themselves up for battle, and the infantry was ordered to follow. When he reached the river and beheld the enemy drawn up on the opposite bank, he made no delay, but instantly plunged into the ford with the cavalry alone. When they saw that he was now in the middle of the river, though they were drawn up ready for battle, they withdrew from the bank with all speed, and Alexander followed them with his cavalry alone. But when the Indians perceived only cavalry, they wheeled round and fought with desperate valor, being about 50,000 in number. When Alexander perceived that their phalanx was densely compact, and that his own infantry was absent, he rode right round their army and made charges upon them, but did not come to close fighting with them. Meanwhile the archers, the Arrianians, and the other battalions of light-armed infantry, being picked men whom he was leading with him, arrived, and his phalanx of infantry was seen not far off. As all kinds of danger were threatening them at once, the Indians now wheeled round again and began to flee with headlong speed into the strongest of their adjacent cities. But Alexander followed them and slew many, while those who escaped into the city were cooped up within it. At first, indeed, he surrounded the city with the horse soldiers as they came up from the march. But when the infantry arrived, he encamped all round the wall for this day, because not much of it was left for making the assault, and his army had been exhausted, the infantry by the long march, and the cavalry by the uninterrupted pursuit, and especially by the passage of the river. Chapter 9. Storming of the Malian stronghold. On the following day, dividing the army into two parts, he himself assaulted the wall at the head of one, and Perdiccas led on the other. Upon this, the Indians did not wait to receive the attack of the Macedonians, but abandoned the walls of the city and fled for safety into the citadel Alexander, and his troops therefore split open a small gate and got within the city long before the others. For those who had been put under Perdiccas were behind time, having experienced difficulty in scaling the walls, as most of them did not bring ladders, thinking that the city had been captured, when they observed that the walls were deserted by the defenders. But when the citadel was seen to be still in the possession of the enemy, and many of them were observed drawn up in front of it to repel attacks, some of the Macedonians tried to force an entry by undermining the wall, and others by placing scaling ladders against it, wherever it was practicable to do so. Alexander, thinking that the men who carried the ladders were too slow, snatched one from a man who was carrying it, placed it against the wall, and began to mount it, crouching under his shield. After him mounted Pusestas, the man who carried the sacred shield which Alexander took from the temple of the Trojan Athena and used to keep with him, and have it carried before him in all his battles. After Pusestas, by the same ladder ascended Leonatus the confidential bodyguard, and up another ladder went Abrias, one of the soldiers who received double pay for distinguished services. The king was now near the battlement of the wall, and leaning his shield against it was pushing some of the Indians within the fort, and had cleared that part of the wall by killing others with his sword. The shield-bearing guards, becoming very anxious for the king's safety, pushed each other with ardor up the same ladder and broke it, so that those who were already mounting fell down and made the ascent impracticable for the rest. Alexander then, standing upon the wall, was being assailed all round from the adjacent towers, for none of the Indians dared approach him. He was also being assailed by the men in the city, who were throwing darts at him from no great distance, for a mound of earth happened to have been heaped up there opposite the wall. Alexander was conspicuous both by the brightness of his weapons and by his extraordinary display of audacity. He therefore perceived that if he remained where he was, he would be incurring danger without being able to perform anything at all worthy of consideration. But if he leaped down within the fort, he might perhaps by this very act strike the Indians with terror. And if he did not, but should only thereby be incurring danger, at any rate he would die not ignobly after performing great deeds of valor worthy of recollection by men of after times. Forming this resolution, he leaped down from the wall into the citadel, where, supporting himself against the wall, he struck with his sword and killed some of the Indians who came to close quarters with him, including their leader, who rushed upon him too boldly. Another man who approached him he kept in check by hurling a stone at him, and a third in like manner. Those who advanced nearer to him he again kept off with his sword, so that the barbarians were no longer willing to approach him, but standing round him cast at him from all sides whatever anyone happened to have or could get hold of at the time. Chapter 10. Alexander dangerously wounded. Meantime Pusestas and Abrias, the soldier entitled to double pay, and after them Leonatus, being the only men who happened to have scaled the wall before the ladders were broken, had leaped down and were fighting in front of the king. Abrias, the man entitled to double pay, fell there, being shot with an arrow in the forehead. Alexander himself also was wounded with an arrow under the breast through his breastplate into the chest, so that Ptolemy says air was breathed out from the wound together with the blood. But although he was faint with exhaustion, he defended himself, as long as his blood was still warm. But the blood streaming out copiously and without ceasing at every expiration of breath, he was seized with a dizziness and swooning, and bending over fell upon his shield. After he had fallen, Pusestas defended him, holding over him in front the sacred shield brought from Troy, and on the other side he was defended by Leonatus. But both these men were themselves wounded, and Alexander was now nearly fainting away from loss of blood. For the Macedonians had experienced great difficulty in the assault also on this account, because those who saw Alexander being shot at upon the wall, and then leaping down into the citadel within, in their ardor arising from fear lest their king should meet with any mishap, by recklessly exposing himself to danger, broke the ladders. Then some began to devise one plan and others another to mount upon the wall, as well as they could in their state of embarrassment, some fixing pegs into the wall, which was made of earth, and suspending themselves from these hoisted themselves up with difficulty by their means. Others got up by mounting one upon the other. The first man who got up threw himself down from the wall into the city, and so on in succession. And when they saw the king lying there on the ground, they all raised a loud lamentation and howl of grief. Now ensued a desperate conflict around his fallen body, one Macedonian after another holding his shield in front of him. In the meantime, some of the soldiers, having shivered in pieces the bar by which the gate in the space of wall between the towers was secured, entered the city a few at the time, while others, inasmuch as a gap had been made in the gate, put their shoulders under it and forced it into the space inside the wall, and thus laid the citadel open in that quarter. Chapter 11. Alexander wounded. Hereupon some of them began to kill the Indians, all of whom they slew, sparing not even a woman or child. Others carried off the king, who was lying in a faint condition, upon his shield, and they could not yet tell whether he was likely to survive. Some authors have stated that Critodmus, a physician of Kos and Asclepiad by birth, made an incision into the injured part and drew the weapon out of the wound. Other authors say that as there was no physician present at the critical moment, Perdiccas, the confidential bodyguard, at Alexander's bidding, made an incision with his sword into the wounded part and removed the weapon. On its removal, there was such a copious effusion of blood that Alexander swooned again, and the effect of the swoon was that the effusion of blood was staunched. Many other things concerning this catastrophe have been recorded by the historians, and rumor, having received the statements as they were given by the first falsifiers of the facts, still preserves them even to our times, nor will she desist from handing the falsehoods on to others also in regular succession, unless a stop is put to it by this history. For example, the common account is that this calamity befell Alexander among the Oxydracians, whereas it really occurred among the Malians, an independent tribe of Indians. The city belonged to the Malians, and the men who wounded him were Malians. These people, indeed, had resolved to join their forces with the Oxydracians, and then to make a desperate struggle. But he forestalled them by marching against them through the waterless country, before any aid could reach them from the Oxydracians, or they could render any help to the latter. Moreover, the common account is that the last battle fought with Darius was near Arbela, at which battle he fled and did not desist from flight until he was arrested by Bessus and put to death at Alexander's approach, just as the battle before this was at Issus, and the first cavalry battle near the Granicus. The cavalry battle did really take place near the Granicus, and the next battle with Darius near Issus. But those authors who make Arbela most distant say that it is 600 stads distant from the place where the last battle between Alexander and Darius was fought, while those who make it least distant say that it is 500 stads off. Moreover, Ptolemy and Aristobulus say that the battle was fought at Gaugamela near the river Beaumatus. But as Gaugamela was not a city, but only a large village, the place is not celebrated, nor is the name pleasing to the ear. Hence, it seems to me that Arbela, being a city, has carried off the glory of the great battle. But if it is necessary to consider that this engagement took place near Arbela, being in reality so far distant from it, then it is allowable to say that the sea battle fought at Salamis occurred near the Isthmus of the Corinthians, and that fought at Artemisium, in Euboea, occurred near Aegina or Sunium. Moreover, in regard to those who covered Alexander with their shields in his peril, all agree that Peucestes did so. But they no longer agree in regard to Leonatus or Abrias, the soldier in receipt of double pay for his distinguished services. Some say that Alexander, having received a blow on the head with a piece of wood, fell down in a fit of dizziness, and that having risen again, he was wounded with a dart through the corslet in the chest. But Ptolemy, son of Lagus, says that he received only this wound in the chest. However, in my opinion, the greatest error made by those who have written the history of Alexander is the following. There are some who have recorded that Ptolemy, son of Lagus, in company with Peucestes, mounted the ladder with Alexander, that Ptolemy held his shield over him when he lay wounded, and that he was called Soter, the preserver, on that account. And yet Ptolemy himself has recorded that he was not even present at this engagement, but was fighting battles against other barbarians at the head of another army. Let me mention these facts as a digression from the main narrative, so that the correct account of such great deeds and calamities may not be a matter of indifference to men of the future. Chapter 12. Anxiety of the soldiers about Alexander. While Alexander was remaining in this place until his wound was cured, the first news which reached the camp from which he had set out to attack the Malians was that he had died of the wound. And at first there arose a sound of lamentation from the entire army, as one man handed the rumor on to another. When they ceased their lamentation, they became spiritless, and felt perplexed as to the man who was to become the leader of the army. For many of the officers seemed to have stood in equal rank and merit, both in the opinion of Alexander and in that of the Macedonians. They were also in a state of perplexity how to get back in safety to their own country, being quite enclosed by so many warlike nations, some of whom had not yet submitted, and who they conjectured would fight stoutly for their freedom, while others would no doubt revolt as soon as they were relieved of their fear of Alexander. Besides, they seemed at that time to be in the midst of impassable rivers, and all things appeared to them uncertain and impracticable now that they were bereft of Alexander. But when at length the news came that he was still alive, they with difficulty acquiesced in it, and did not yet believe that he was likely to survive. Even when a letter came from the king, saying that he was coming down to the camp in a short time, this did not appear to most of them worthy of credit, on account of their excessive fear. For they conjectured that the letter was concocted by his confidential bodyguards and generals. Chapter 13. Joy of the soldiers at Alexander's recovery. When Alexander became acquainted with this, for fear some attempt at a revolution might be made in the army, he had himself conveyed, as soon as it could be done with safety, to the bank of the river Hydraiots, and placed in a boat to sail down the river. For the camp was at the confluence of the Hydraiots and Assassines, where Hephaestion was at the head of the army and Nearchus of the fleet. When the ship bearing the king approached the camp, he ordered the tent covering to be removed from the stern, that he might be visible to all. But they were still incredulous, thinking, forsooth, that Alexander's corpse was being conveyed on the vessel, until at length he stretched out his hand to the multitude, when the ship was nearing the bank. Then the men raised a cheer, lifting their hands, some towards the sky and others to the king himself. Many even shed involuntary tears at the unexpected sight. Some of the shield-bearing guards brought a litter for him when he was conveyed out of the ship, but he ordered them to fetch his horse. When he was seen again mounting his horse, the whole army re-echoed with loud clapping of hands, so that the banks of the river and the groves near them reverberated with the sound. On approaching his tent, he dismounted from his horse, so that he might be seen walking. Then the men came near, some on one side, others on the other, some touching his hands, others his knees, others only his clothes. Some only came close to get a sight of him, and went away having chanted his praise, while others threw garlands upon him, or the flowers which the country of India supplied at that season of the year. Nearchus says that some of his friends incurred his displeasure, reproaching him for exposing himself to danger in the front of the army in battle, which they said was the duty of a private soldier, and not that of the general. It seems to me that Alexander was offended at these remarks, because he knew that they were correct, and that he deserved the censure. However, like those who are mastered by any other pleasure, he had not sufficient self-control to keep aloof from danger, through his impetuosity in battle and his passion for glory. Nearchus also says that a certain old Boeotian, whose name he does not mention, perceiving that Alexander was offended at the censures of his friends and was looking sullenly at them, came near him, and speaking in the Boeotian dialect said, "O Alexander, it is the part of heroes to perform great deeds," and repeated a certain iambic verse, the purport of which is that the man who performs anything great is destined also to suffer. This man was not only acceptable to Alexander at the time, but was afterwards received into his more intimate acquaintance. Chapter 14. Voyage down the Hydraiots and Assassines into the Indus. At this time arrived envoys from the Malians who still survived, offering the submission of the nation. Also from the Oxydracians came both the leaders of the cities and the governors of the provinces, accompanied by the other 150 most notable men, with full powers to make a treaty, bringing the gifts which are considered most valuable among the Indians, and also, like the Malians, offering the submission of their nation. They said that their error in not having sent an embassy to him before was pardonable, because they excelled other races in the desire to be free and independent, and their freedom had been secure from the time Dionysus came into India until Alexander came. But if it seemed good to him, inasmuch as there was a general report that he also was sprung from gods, they were willing to receive whatever viceroy he might appoint, pay the tribute decreed by him, and give him as many hostages as he might demand. He therefore demanded the 1,000 best men of the nation, whom he might hold as hostages if he pleased, and if not, that he might keep them as soldiers in his army until he had finished the war which he was waging against the other Indians. They accordingly selected the 1,000 best and tallest men of their number, and sent them to him, together with 500 chariots and charioteers, though these were not demanded. Alexander appointed Philip viceroy over these people and the Malians who were still surviving. He sent back the hostages to them, but retained the chariots. When he had satisfactorily arranged these matters, since many vessels had been built during the delay arising from his being wounded, he embarked 1,700 of the cavalry companions, as many of the light-armed troops as before, and 10,000 infantry, and sailed a short distance down the river Hydriots. But when that river mingled its waters with the Assassines, the latter giving its name to the united stream, he continued his voyage down the Assassines until he reached its junction with the Indus. For these 4 large rivers, which are all navigable, discharge their water into the river Indus, though each does not retain its distinct name. For the Hydaspes discharges itself into the Assassines, and after the junction the whole stream forms what is called the Assassines. Again this same river unites with the Hydriots, and after absorbing this river, still retains its own name. After this, the Assassines takes in the Hyphasis, and finally flows into the Indus under its own name. But after the junction it yields its name to the Indus. From this point, I have no doubt that the Indus proceeds 100 stades, and perhaps more, before it is divided so as to form the delta, and there it spreads out more like a lake than a river. Chapter 15. Voyage down the Indus to the land of Musicanus. There, at the confluence of the Assassines and Indus, he waited until Perdiccas with the army arrived, after having routed on his way the independent tribe of the Abystanians. Meantime, he was joined by other 30-oared galleys and trading vessels which had been built for him among the Zathrians, another independent tribe of Indians who had yielded to him. From the Aussadians, who were also an independent tribe of Indians, came envoys to offer the submission of their nation. Having fixed the confluence of the Assassines and Indus as the limit of Philip's viceroyalty, he left with him all the Thracians and as many men from the infantry regiments as appeared to him sufficient to provide for the security of the country. He then ordered a city to be founded there at the very junction of the 2 rivers, expecting that it would become large and famous among men. He also ordered a dockyard to be made there. At this time the Bactrian Oxyartes, father of his wife Roxana, came to him, to whom he gave the viceroyalty over the Peripamessadians, after dismissing the former viceroy, Turiaspes, because he was reported to be exercising his authority improperly. Then he transported Craterus with the main body of the army and the elephants to the left bank of the river Indus, both because it seemed easier for a heavy-armed force to march along that side of the river, and the tribes dwelling near were not quite friendly. He himself sailed down to the capital of the Sogdians, where he fortified another city, made another dockyard, and repaired his shattered vessels. He appointed Oxyartes viceroy, and Python general of the land extending from the confluence of the Indus and Assassines as far as the sea, together with all the coastland of India. He then again dispatched Craterus with his army through the country of the Arachosians and Drangians, and himself sailed down the river into the dominions of Musicanus, which was reported to be the most prosperous part of India. He advanced against this king because he had not yet come to meet him to offer the submission of himself and his land, nor had he sent envoys to seek his alliance. He had not even sent him the gifts which were suitable for a great king, or asked any favor from him. He accelerated his voyage down the river to such a degree that he succeeded in reaching the confines of the land of Musicanus before he had even heard that Alexander had started against him. Musicanus was so greatly alarmed that he went as fast as he could to meet him, bringing with him the gifts valued most highly among the Indians, and taking all his elephants. He offered to surrender both his nation and himself, at the same time acknowledging his error, which was the most effectual way with Alexander for anyone to get what he requested. Accordingly, for these considerations, Alexander granted him an indemnity for his offenses. He also granted him the privilege of ruling the city and country, both of which Alexander admired. Craterus was directed to fortify the citadel in the capital, which was done while Alexander was still present. A garrison was also placed in it, because he thought the place suitable for keeping the circumjacent tribes in subjection. Chapter 16. Campaign against Oxycanus and Sambus. Then he took the archers, Agrianians, and cavalry sailing with him, and marched against the governor of that country, whose name was Oxycanus, because he neither came himself nor did envoys come from him, to offer the surrender of himself and his land. At the very first assault, he took by storm the two largest cities under the rule of Oxycanus, in the second of which that prince himself was captured. The booty he gave to his army, but the elephants he led with himself. The other cities in the same land surrendered to him as he advanced, nor did any one turn to resist him. So cowed in spirit had all the Indians now become at the thought of Alexander and his fortune. He then marched back against Sambus, whom he had appointed viceroy of the mountaineer Indians, and who was reported to have fled, because he learned that Musicanus had been pardoned by Alexander and was ruling over his own land. For he was at war with Musicanus. But when Alexander approached the city which the country of Sambus held as its metropolis, the name of which was Sindamana, the gates were thrown open to him at his approach, and the relations of Sambus reckoned up his money and went out to meet him, taking with them the elephants also. They assured him that Sambus had fled, not from any hostile feeling towards Alexander, but fearing on account of the pardon of Musicanus. He also captured another city which had revolted at this time, and slew as many of the Brachmans as had been instigators of this revolt. These men are the philosophers of the Indians, of whose philosophy, if such it may be called, I shall give an account in my book descriptive of India. Chapter 17. Musicanus executed, capture of Patala. Meantime he was informed that Musicanus had revolted. He dispatched the viceroy, Pithon, son of Agenor, with a sufficient army against him, while he himself marched against the cities which had been put under the rule of Musicanus. Some of these he razed to the ground, reducing the inhabitants to slavery, and into others he introduced garrisons and fortified the citadels. After accomplishing this, he returned to the camp and fleet. By this time Musicanus had been captured by Pithon, who was bringing him to Alexander. The king ordered him to be hanged in his own country, and with him as many of the Brachmans as had instigated him to the revolt. Then came to him the ruler of the land of the Patalians, who said that the delta formed by the river Indus was still larger than the Egyptian delta. This man surrendered to him the whole of his own land and entrusted both himself and his property to him. Alexander sent him away again in possession of his own dominions, with instructions to provide whatever was needful for the reception of the army. He then sent Craterus into Carmania with the brigades of Attalus, Meleager, and Antigens, some of the archers, and as many of the companions and other Macedonians as, being now unfit for military service, he was dispatching to Macedonia by the route through the lands of the Arachosians and Zarangians. To Craterus he also gave the duty of leading the elephants, but the rest of the army, except the part of it which was sailing with himself down to the sea, he put under the command of Hephaestion. He transported Pithon with the cavalry lancers and Agrianians to the opposite bank of the Indus, not the one along which Hephaestion was about to lead the army. Pithon was ordered to collect men to colonize the cities which had just been fortified, and to form a junction with the king at Patala, after having settled the affairs of the Indians of that region, if they attempted any revolutionary proceedings. On the third day of his voyage, Alexander was informed that the governor of the Patalians had collected most of his subjects and was going away by stealth, having left his land deserted. For this reason Alexander sailed down the river with greater speed than before, and when he arrived at Patala, he found both the country and the city deserted by the inhabitants and tillers of the soil. He, however, dispatched the lightest troops in his army in pursuit of the fugitives, and when some of them were captured, he sent them away to the rest, bidding them be of good courage and return, for they might inhabit the city and till the country as before. Most of them accordingly returned. Chapter 18. Voyage down the Indus. After instructing Hephaestion to fortify the citadel in Patala, he sent men into the adjacent country, which was waterless, to dig wells and to render the land fit for habitation. Certain of the native barbarians attacked these men, and falling upon them unawares slew some of them. But having lost many of their own men, they fled into the desert. The work was therefore accomplished by those who had been sent out, another army having joined them, which Alexander had dispatched to take part in the work, when he heard of the attack of the barbarians. Near Patala, the water of the Indus is divided into two large rivers, both of which retain the name of Indus as far as the sea. Here Alexander constructed a harbor and dockyard, and when his works had advanced towards completion, he resolved to sail down as far as the mouth of the right branch of the river. He gave Leonatus the command of 1,000 cavalry and 8,000 heavy and light-armed infantry, and sent him to march through the island of Patala opposite the naval expedition, while he himself took the fastest sailing vessels, having 1.5 bank of oars, all the 30-oared galleys, and some of the boats, and began to sail down the right branch of the river. The Indians of that region had fled, and consequently he could get no pilot for the voyage, and the navigation of the river was very difficult. On the day after the start, a storm arose, and the wind blowing right against the stream made the river hollow and shattered the hulls of the vessels violently, so that most of his ships were injured, and some of the 30-oared galleys were entirely broken up. But they succeeded in running them aground before they quite fell to pieces in the water, and others were therefore constructed. He then sent the quickest of the light-armed troops into the land beyond the river's bank and captured some Indians, who from this time piloted him down the channel. But when they arrived at the place where the river expands, so that where it was widest it extended 200 stads, a strong wind blew from the outer sea, and the oars could hardly be raised in the swell. They therefore took refuge again in a canal into which his pilots conducted them. Chapter 19. Voyage down the Indus into the sea. While their vessels were moored here, the phenomenon of the ebb and flow of the tide in the Great Sea occurred, so that their ships were left upon dry ground. This caused Alexander and his companions no small alarm, inasmuch as they were previously quite unacquainted with it. But they were much more alarmed when, the time coming round again, the water approached and the hulls of the vessels were raised aloft. The ships which it caught settled in the mud were raised aloft without any damage, and floated again without receiving any injury. But those that had been left on the drier land and had not a firm settlement, when an immense compact wave advanced, either fell foul of each other or were dashed against the land, and thus shattered to pieces. When Alexander had repaired these vessels, as well as his circumstances permitted, he sent some men on in advance down the river in 2 boats to explore the island, at which the natives said he must moor his vessels in his voyage to the sea. They told him that the name of the island was Saluda. As he was informed that there were harbors in this island, that it was a large one and had plenty of water in it, he made the rest of his fleet put in there. But he himself with the best sailing ships advanced beyond, to see if the mouth of the river afforded an easy voyage out into the open sea. After advancing about 200 stads from the first island, they descried another which was quite out in the sea. Then indeed they returned to the island in the river and, having moored his vessels near the extremity of it, Alexander offered sacrifice to those gods to whom he said he had been directed by Ammon to sacrifice. On the following day, he sailed down to the other island, which was in the deep sea, and having come to shore here also, he offered other sacrifices to other gods and in another manner. These sacrifices he also offered according to the oracular instructions of Ammon. Then having gone beyond the mouths of the river Indus, he sailed out into the open sea, as he said, to discover if any land lay anywhere near in the sea. But in my opinion, chiefly that he might be able to say that he had navigated the great outer sea of India. There he sacrificed some bulls to Poseidon and cast them into the sea, and having poured out a libation after the sacrifice, he threw the goblet and bowls, which were golden, into the deep as thank offerings, praying the god to escort safely for him the fleet, which he intended to dispatch to the Persian Gulf and the mouths of the Euphrates and Tigris. Chapter 20. exploration of the mouths of the Indus. Returning to Patala, he found that the citadel had been fortified and that Pithon had arrived with his army, having accomplished everything for which he was dispatched. He ordered Hephaestion to prepare what was needful for the fortification of a naval station and the construction of dockyards, for he resolved to leave behind here a fleet of many ships near the city of Patala, where the river Indus divides itself into two streams. He himself sailed down again into the Great Sea by the other mouth of the Indus, to ascertain which branch of the river is easier to navigate. The mouths of the river Indus are about 1,800 stades distant from each other. In the voyage down, he arrived at a large lake in the mouth of the river, which the river makes by spreading itself out, or perhaps the waters of the surrounding district draining into it make it large, so that it very much resembles a gulf of the sea. For in it were seen fish like those in the sea, larger indeed than those in our sea. Having moored his ships then in this lake, where the pilots directed, he left there most of the soldiers and all the boats with Leonidas. But he himself with the 30-oared galleys and the vessels with 1.5 row of oars passed beyond the mouth of the Indus, and advancing into the sea also this way, ascertained that the outlet of the river on this side, i.e. the west, was easier to navigate than the other. He moored his ships near the shore, and taking with him some of the cavalry went along the sea-coast 3 days' journey, exploring what kind of country it was for a coasting voyage, and ordering wells to be dug so that the sailors might have water to drink. He then returned to the ships and sailed back to Patala, but he sent a part of his army along the sea-coast to effect the same thing, instructing them to return to Patala when they had dug the wells. Sailing again down to the lake, he there constructed another harbor and dockyard, and leaving a garrison for the place, he collected sufficient food to supply the army for 4 months, as well as whatever else he could procure for the coasting voyage. Chapter 21. Campaign against the Oricians. The season of the year was then unfit for voyaging, for the periodical winds prevailed, which at that season do not blow there from the north, as with us, but from the great sea in the direction of the south wind. Moreover, it was reported that there the sea was fit for navigation after the beginning of winter, from the setting of the Pleiades until the winter solstice. For at that season mild breezes usually blow from the land, drenched as it has been with great rains, and these winds are convenient on a coasting voyage both for oars and sails. Nearchus, who had been placed in command of the fleet, waited for the coasting season, but Alexander, starting from Patala, advanced with all his army as far as the river Arabius. He then took half of the shield-bearing guards and archers, the infantry regiments called foot companions, the guard of the companion cavalry, a squadron of each of the other cavalry regiments, and all the horsebowmen, and turned away thence on the left towards the sea to dig wells, so that there might be abundance of them for the fleet sailing along on the coasting voyage, and at the same time to make an unexpected attack upon the Oricians, a tribe of the Indians in this region, which had long been independent. This he meditated doing because they had performed no friendly act either to himself or his army. He placed Hephaestion in command of the forces left behind. The Arabicians, another independent tribe dwelling near the river Arabius, thinking that they could not cope with Alexander in battle, and yet being unwilling to submit to him, fled into the desert when they heard that he was approaching. But crossing the river Arabius, which was both narrow and shallow, and traveling by night through the greater part of the desert, he came near the inhabited country at daybreak. Then ordering the infantry to follow him in regular line, he took the cavalry with him, dividing it into squadrons, that it might occupy a very large part of the plain, and thus marched into the land of the Oricians. All those who turned to defend themselves were cut to pieces by the cavalry, and many of the others were taken prisoners. He then encamped near a small piece of water, but when Hephaestion formed a junction with him, he advanced farther. Arriving at the largest village of the tribe of the Oricians, which was called Rambatia, he commended the place and thought that if he colonized a city there, it would become great and prosperous. He therefore left Hephaestion behind to carry out this project. Chapter 22. March through the desert of Gadrosia. Again he took half of the shield-bearing guards and Agrianians, the guard of cavalry and the horsebowmen, and marched forward to the confines of the Gadrosians and Oricians, where he was informed that the passage was narrow, and the Oricians were drawn up with the Gadrosians and were encamping in front of the pass, with the purpose of barring Alexander's passage. they had indeed marshaled themselves there. But when it was reported that he was already approaching, most of them fled from the pass, deserting their guard. The chiefs of the Oricians, however, came to him, offering to surrender both themselves and their nation. He instructed these to collect the multitude of their people together and send them to their own abodes, since they were not about to suffer any harm. Over these people he placed Apollophanes as viceroy, and with him he left Leonatus the confidential bodyguard in Aura, at the head of all the Agrianians, some of the bowmen and cavalry, and the rest of the Grecian mercenary infantry and cavalry. He instructed him to wait until the fleet had sailed round the land, to colonize the city, and to regulate the affairs of the Oricians so that they might pay the greater respect to the viceroy. He himself, with the main body of the army, for Hephaestion had arrived at the head of the men who had been left behind, advanced into the land of the Gadrosians by a route most of which was desert. Aristobulus says that in this desert many myrrh trees grew, larger than the ordinary kind, and that the Phoenicians, who accompanied the army for trafficking, gathered the gum of myrrh, and loading the beasts of burden, carried it away. For there was a great quantity of it, inasmuch as it exuded from large stems and had never before been gathered. He also says that this desert produces many odoriferous roots of nard, which the Phoenicians likewise gathered. But much of it was trampled down by the army, and a sweet perfume was diffused far and wide over the land by the trampling, so great was the abundance of it. In the desert there were also other kinds of trees, one of which had foliage like that of the bay tree, and grew in places washed by the waves of the sea. These trees were on ground which was left dry by the ebb tide, but when the water advanced they looked as if they had grown in the sea. Of others the roots were always washed by the sea, because they grew in hollow places, from which the water could not retire, and yet the trees were not destroyed by the sea. Some of these trees in this region were even 30 cubits high. At that season they happened to be in bloom, and the flower was very much like the white violet, but the perfume was far superior to that of the latter. There was also another thorny stalk growing out of the earth, the thorn on which was so strong that, piercing the clothes of some men just riding past, it pulled the horseman down from his horse rather than be itself torn off the stalk. It is also said that when hares run past these bushes, the thorns cling to their fur, and thus these animals are caught, as birds are with birdlime or fish with hooks. However, they were easily cut through with steel. And when the thorns are cut, the stalk gives forth much juice, still more abundantly than fig trees do in the springtime, and more pungent. Chapter 23. March through the desert of Gadrosia. Thence Alexander marched through the land of the Gadrosians by a difficult route, which was also destitute of all the necessaries of life, and in many places there was no water for the army. Moreover, they were compelled to march most of the way by night and a great distance from the sea. However, he was very desirous of coming to the part of the country along the sea, both to see what harbors were there, and to make what preparations he could on his march for the fleet, either by employing his men in digging wells or by making arrangements somewhere for a market and anchorage. But the part of the country of the Gadrosians near the sea was entirely desert. He therefore sent Thoas, son of Mandrodorus, with a few horsemen down to the sea, to reconnoiter and see if there happened to be any haven anywhere near, or whether there was water or any other of the necessaries of life not far from the sea. This man returned and reported that he found some fishermen upon the shore living in stifling huts, which were made by putting together mussel shells, and the backbones of fishes were used to form the roofs. He also said that these fishermen used little water, obtaining it with difficulty by scraping away the gravel, and that what they got was not at all fresh. When Alexander reached a certain place in Gadrosia, where corn was more abundant, he seized it and placed it upon the beasts of burden, and marking it with his own seal, he ordered it to be conveyed down to the sea. But while he was marching to the halting stage nearest to the sea, the soldiers paying little regard to the seal, the guards made use of the corn themselves, and gave a share of it to those who were especially pinched with hunger. To such a degree were they overcome by their misery that after mature deliberation, they resolved to take account of the visible and already impending destruction rather than the danger of incurring the king's wrath, which was not before their eyes and still remote. When Alexander ascertained the necessity which constrained them so to act, he pardoned those who had done the deed. He himself hastened forward to collect from the land all he could for victualling the army which was sailing round with the fleet, and sent Cretheus the Calatian to convey the supplies to the coast. He also ordered the natives to grind as much corn as they could and convey it down from the interior of the country, together with dates and sheep for sale to the soldiers. Moreover, he sent Telephus, one of the confidential companions, down to another place on the coast with a small quantity of ground corn. Chapter 24. March through Gadrosia. He then advanced towards the capital of the Gadrosians, which was named Pura, and he arrived there in 60 days after starting from Ora. Most of the historians of Alexander's reign assert that all the hardships which his army suffered in Asia were not worthy of comparison with the labors undergone here. Nearchus alone asserts that Alexander pursued this route, not from ignorance of the difficulty of the journey, but because he heard that no one had ever hitherto passed that way with an army and emerged in safety from the desert, except Semiramis when she fled from India. The natives said that even she emerged with only 20 men of her army, and that Cyrus, son of Cambyses, escaped with only 7 of his men. For they say that Cyrus also marched into this region for the purpose of invading India, but that he did not effect his retreat before losing the greater part of his army, from the desert and the other difficulties of this route. When Alexander received this information, he was seized with a desire of excelling Cyrus and Semiramis. Nearchus says that he turned his march this way, both for this reason and at the same time for the purpose of conveying provisions near the fleet. The scorching heat and lack of water destroyed a great part of the army, and especially the beasts of burden, most of which perished from thirst, and some of them even from the depth and heat of the sand, because it had been thoroughly scorched by the sun. For they met with lofty ridges of deep sand, not closely pressed and hardened, but such as received those who stepped upon it just as if they were stepping into mud, or rather into untrodden snow. At the same time, too, the horses and mules suffered still more, both in going up and coming down the hills, from the unevenness of the road as well as from its instability. The length of the marches between the stages also exceedingly distressed the army, for the lack of water often compelled them to make the marches of unusual length. When they traveled by night on a journey which it was necessary to complete, and at daybreak came to water, they suffered no hardship at all. But if, while still on the march, on account of the length of the way, they were caught by the heat, then they did indeed suffer hardships from the blazing sun, being at the same time oppressed by unassuageable thirst. Chapter 25. Sufferings of the army. The soldiers killed many of the beasts of burden of their own accord, for when provisions were lacking, they came together and slaughtered most of the horses and mules. They ate the flesh of these and said that they had died of thirst or had perished from the heat. There was no one who divulged the real truth of their conduct, both on account of the men's distress and because all alike were implicated in the same offense. What was being done had not escaped Alexander's notice, but he saw that the best cure for the present state of affairs would be to pretend to be ignorant of it, rather than to permit it as a thing known to himself. The consequence was that it was no longer easy to convey the soldiers who were suffering from disease, or those who were left behind on the roads on account of the heat, partly from the want of beasts of burden and partly because the men themselves were knocking the wagons to pieces, not being able to draw them on account of the depth of the sand. They did this also because in the first stages they were compelled on this account to go, not by the shortest routes, but by those which were easiest for the carriages. Thus some were left behind along the roads on account of sickness, others from fatigue or the effects of the heat, or from not being able to bear up against the drought. And there was no one either to show them the way or to remain and tend them in their sickness. For the expedition was being made with great urgency, and the care of individual persons was necessarily neglected in the zeal displayed for the safety of the army as a whole. As they generally made the marches by night, some of the men were overcome by sleep on the road. Afterwards, rousing up again, those who still had strength followed upon the tracks of the army, but only a few out of many overtook the main body in safety. Most of them perished in the sand, like men shipwrecked on the sea. Another calamity also befell the army, which greatly distressed men, horses, and beasts of burden. For the country of the Gadrosians is supplied with rain by the periodical winds, just as that of the Indians is. Not the plains of Gadrosia, but only the mountains where the clouds are carried by the wind, and are dissolved into rain without passing beyond the summits of the mountains. On one occasion, when the army bivouacked, for the sake of its water, near a small brook which was a winter torrent, about the second watch of the night the brook which flowed there was suddenly swelled by the rains in the mountains which had fallen unperceived by the soldiers. The torrent advanced with so great a flood as to destroy most of the wives and children of the men who followed the army, and to sweep away all the royal baggage as well as all the beasts of burden still remaining. The soldiers, after great exertions, were hardly able to save themselves together with their weapons, many of which they lost beyond recovery. When, after enduring the burning heat and thirst, they lighted upon abundance of water, many of them perished from drinking to excess, not being able to check their appetite for it. For this reason, Alexander generally pitched his camp, not near the water itself, but at a distance of about 20 stads from it, to prevent the men and beasts from pressing in crowds into the river and thus perishing, and at the same time to prevent those who had no control over themselves from fouling the water for the rest of the army by stepping into the springs or streams. Chapter 26. Alexander's magnanimous conduct. Here I have resolved not to pass over in silence the most noble deed perhaps ever performed by Alexander, which occurred either in this land, or, according to the assertion of some other authors, still earlier among the Peripamessadians. The army was continuing its march through the sand, though the heat of the sun was already scorching, because it was necessary to reach water before halting. They were far on the journey, and Alexander himself, though oppressed with thirst, was nevertheless with great pain and difficulty leading the army on foot, so that his soldiers, as is usual in such a case, might more patiently bear their hardships by the equalization of the distress. At this time, some of the light-armed soldiers, starting away from the army in quest of water, found some collected in a shallow cleft, a small and mean spring. Collecting this water with difficulty, they came with all speed to Alexander, as if they were bringing him some great boon. As soon as they approached the king, they poured the water into a helmet and carried it to him. He took it, and commending the men who brought it, immediately poured it upon the ground in the sight of all. As a result of this action, the entire army was reinvigorated to so great a degree that anyone would have imagined that the water poured away by Alexander had furnished a draught to every man. This deed beyond all others I commend as evidence of Alexander's power of endurance and self-control, as well as of his skill in managing an army. The following adventure also occurred to the army in that country. At last, the guides declared that they no longer remembered the way, because the tracks of it had been rendered invisible by the wind blowing the sand over them. Moreover, in the deep sand which had been everywhere reduced to one level, there was nothing by which they could conjecture the right way, not even the usual trees growing along it, nor any solid hillock rising up. And they had not practiced themselves in making journeys by the stars at night or by the sun in the daytime, as sailors do by the constellations of the bears, the Phoenicians by the little bear, and other men by the greater bear. Then at length Alexander perceived that it was necessary for him to lead the way by declining to the left, and taking a few horsemen with him, he advanced in front of the army. But when the horses even of these were exhausted by the heat, he left most of these men behind, and rode away with only 5 men and found the sea. Having scraped away the shingle on the sea beach, he found water fresh and pure, and then went and fetched the whole army. For 7 days they marched along the sea-coast, supplying themselves with water from the shore. Thence he led his expedition into the interior, for now the guides knew the way. Chapter 27. March through Carmania, punishment of viceroys. When he arrived at the capital of Gadrosia, he there gave his army a rest. He deposed Apollophanes from the viceroyalty, because he discovered that he had paid no heed to his instructions. Thoas was appointed viceroy over the people of this district, but as he fell ill and died, Sabaedius succeeded to the office. The same man had also lately been appointed by Alexander viceroy of Carmania. But now the rule over the Arachosians and Gadrosians was given to him, and Tlepolemus, son of Pythophanes, received Carmania. The king was already advancing into Carmania, when news was brought to him that Philip, the viceroy of the country of the Indians, had been plotted against by the mercenaries and treacherously killed. But that Philip's Macedonian bodyguards had caught some of the murderers in the very act and others afterwards, and had put them to death. When he had ascertained this, he sent a letter into India to Eudemus and Taxels, ordering them to administer the affairs of the land which had previously been subordinated to Philip until he could send a viceroy for it. When he arrived in Carmania, Craterus effected a junction with him, bringing with him the rest of the army and the elephants. He also brought Ordanes, whom he had arrested for revolting and trying to effect a revolution. Thither also came Stasenor, the viceroy of the Arrians and Zarangians, accompanied by Pharasmanes, son of Frathafernes, the viceroy of the Parthians and Hyrcanians. There came also the generals who had been left with Parmenio over the army in Media, Cleander, Sitalces, and Hyrcanian, bringing with them the greater part of their army. Both the natives and the soldiers themselves brought many accusations against Cleander and Sitalces, as for example, that the temples had been pillaged by them, old tombs rifled, and other acts of injustice, recklessness, and tyranny perpetrated against their subjects. As these charges were proved, he put them to death, in order to inspire others who might be left as viceroys, governors, or prefects of provinces with the fear of suffering equal penalties with them if they swerved from the path of duty. This was one of the chief means by which Alexander kept in subordination the nations which he had conquered in war or which had voluntarily submitted to him, though they were so many in number and so far distant from each other. Because under his regal sway, it was not allowed that those who were ruled should be unjustly treated by those who ruled. At that time, Hyrcanian was acquitted of the charge, but soon after, being convicted by the men of Susa of having pillaged the temple in that city, he also suffered punishment. Stasenor and Frathafernes came to Alexander bringing a multitude of beasts of burden and many camels, when they learnt that he was marching by the route to Gadrosia, conjecturing that his army would suffer the very hardships which it did suffer. Therefore these men arrived just at the very time they were required, as also did their camels and beasts of burden. For Alexander distributed all these animals to the officers man by man, to all the various squadrons and centuries of the cavalry, and to the various companies of the infantry, as their number allowed him. Chapter 28. Alexander in Carmania. Certain authors have said, though to me the statement seems incredible, that Alexander led his forces through Carmania lying extended with his companions upon two covered wagons joined together, the flute being played to him, and that the soldiers followed him wearing garlands and sporting. Food was provided for them, as well as all kinds of dainties which had been brought together along the roads by the Carmanians. They say that he did this in imitation of the Bacchic revelry of Dionysus, because a story was told about that deity, that after subduing the Indians, he traversed the greater part of Asia in this manner and received the appellation of Thryambus. For the same reason, the processions in honor of victories after war were called Thryambi. This has been recorded neither by Ptolemy, son of Lagus, nor by Aristobulus, son of Aristobulus, nor by any other writer whose testimony on such points anyone would feel to be worthy of credit. It is sufficient, therefore, for me to record it as unworthy of belief. But as to what I am now going to describe, I follow the account of Aristobulus. In Carmania, Alexander offered sacrifices to the gods as thank offerings for his victory over the Indians, and because his army had been brought in safety out of Gadrosia. He also celebrated a musical and gymnastic contest. He then appointed Pusestas, one of his confidential bodyguards, having already resolved to make him viceroy of Persis. He wished him, before being appointed to the viceroyalty, to experience this honor and evidence of confidence, as a reward for his exploit among the Malians. Up to this time, the number of his confidential bodyguards had been 7. Leonatus, son of Antias, Hephaestion, son of Amintor, Lysimachus, son of Agathocles, Aristonus, son of Pisius, these 4 being Pelians, Perdiccas, son of Orontes from Orstes, Ptolemy, son of Lagus, and Pithon, son of Cratias the Heordians. Pusestas, who had held the shield over Alexander, was now added to them as an 8th. At this time Nearchus, having sailed round the coast of Ora and Gadrosia, and that of the Ichthyophagi, put into port in the inhabited part of the coastland of Carmania, and going up thence into the interior with a few men he reported to Alexander the particulars of the voyage, which he had made along the coasts of the external sea. Nearchus was then sent down to the sea again to sail round as far as the country of Susiana and the outlets of the river Tigris. How he sailed from the river Indus to the Persian Sea and the mouth of the Tigris, I shall describe in a separate book, following the account of Nearchus himself, for he also wrote a history of Alexander in Greek. Perhaps I shall be able to compose this narrative in the future, if inclination and the divine influence urge me to it. Alexander now ordered Hephaestion to march into Persis from Carmania along the seashore with the larger division of the army and the beasts of burden, taking with him also the elephants. Because, as he was making the expedition in the season of winter, the part of Persis near the sea was warm and possessed abundant supplies of provisions. Chapter 29. Alexander in Persis, tomb of Cyrus repaired. He himself then marched to Pasargadae in Persis, with the lightest of his infantry, the companion cavalry, and a part of the archers, but he sent Stasanor down to his own land. When he arrived at the confines of Persis, he found that Phrasciortes was no longer viceroy, for he happened to have died of disease while Alexander was still in India. Orxines was managing the affairs of the country, not because he had been appointed ruler by Alexander, but because he thought it his duty to keep Persia in order for him, as there was no other ruler. Atropates, the viceroy of Media, also came to Pasargadae, bringing Bariaxes, a Mede under arrest, because he had assumed the upright headdress and called himself king of the Persians and Medes. With Bariaxes, he also brought those who had taken part with him in the attempted revolution and revolt. Alexander put these men to death. He was grieved by the outrage committed upon the tomb of Cyrus, son of Cambyses, for according to Aristobulus, he found it dug through and pillaged. The tomb of the famous Cyrus was in the royal park at Pasargadae, and around it a grove of all kinds of trees had been planted. It was also watered by a stream, and high grass grew in the meadow. The base of the tomb itself had been made of squared stone in the form of a rectangle. Above there was a stone building surmounted by a roof, with a door leading within, so narrow that even a small man could with difficulty enter, after suffering much discomfort. In the building lay a golden coffin, in which the body of Cyrus had been buried, and by the side of the coffin was a couch, the feet of which were of gold wrought with the hammer. A carpet of Babylonian tapestry with purple rugs formed the bedding. Upon it were also a Median coat with sleeves and other tunics of Babylonian manufacture. Aristobulus adds that Median trousers and robes dyed the color of hyacinth were also lying upon it, as well as others of purple and various other colors. Moreover, there were collars, sabers, and earrings of gold and precious stones soldered together, and near them stood a table. On the middle of the couch lay the coffin which contained the body of Cyrus. Within the enclosure, near the ascent leading to the tomb, there was a small house built for the Magians who guarded the tomb, a duty which they had discharged ever since the time of Cambyses, son of Cyrus, son succeeding father as guard. To these men, a sheep and specified quantities of wheaten flour and wine were given daily by the king, and a horse once a month as a sacrifice to Cyrus. Upon the tomb, an inscription in Persian letters had been placed, which bore the following meaning in the Persian language. O man, I am Cyrus, son of Cambyses, who founded the empire of the Persians and was king of Asia. Do not therefore grudge me this monument. As soon as Alexander had conquered Persia, he was very desirous of entering the tomb of Cyrus, but he found that everything else had been carried off except the coffin and couch. They had even maltreated the king's body, for they had torn off the lid of the coffin and cast out the corpse. They had tried to make the coffin itself of smaller bulk and thus more portable by cutting part of it off and crushing part of it up, but as their efforts did not succeed, they departed, leaving the coffin in that state. Aristobulus says that he was himself commissioned by Alexander to restore the tomb for Cyrus, to put in the coffin the parts of the body still preserved, to put the lid on, and to restore the parts of the coffin which had been defaced. Moreover, he was instructed to stretch the couch tight with bands, and to deposit all the other things which used to lie there for ornament, both resembling the former ones and of the same number. He was ordered also to do away with the door, building part of it up with stone and plastering part of it over with cement, and finally to put the royal seal upon the cement. Alexander arrested the Magians who were the guards of the tomb, and put them to the torture to make them confess who had done the deed. But in spite of the torture, they confessed nothing either about themselves or any other person. In no other way were they proved to have been privy to the deed. They were therefore released by Alexander. Chapter 30. Pusestas appointed viceroy of Persis. Thence he proceeded to the royal palace of the Persians, which he had on a former occasion himself burnt down, as I have previously related, expressing my disapprobation of the act, and on his return Alexander himself did not commend it. Many charges were brought by the Persians against Orcsines, who ruled them after the death of Phrasiortes. He was convicted of having pillaged temples and royal tombs, and of having unjustly put many of the Persians to death. He was therefore hanged by men acting under Alexander's orders, and Pusestas, the confidential bodyguard, was appointed viceroy of Persis. The king placed special confidence in him both for other reasons, and especially on account of his exploit among the Malians, where he braved the greatest dangers and helped to save Alexander's life. Besides this, he did not refuse to accommodate himself to the Asiatic mode of living, and as soon as he was appointed to the position of viceroy of Persis, he openly assumed the native garb, being the only man among the Macedonians who adopted the Median dress in preference to the Grecian. He also learnt to speak the Persian language correctly and comported himself in all other respects like a Persian. For this conduct, he was not only commended by Alexander, but the Persians also were highly delighted with him for preferring their national customs to those of his own forefathers. Book 7. Chapter 1. Alexander's Plans, the Indian Philosophers. When Alexander arrived at Pasargadae and Persepolis, he was seized with an ardent desire to sail down the Euphrates and to graze to the Persian Sea, and to see the mouths of those rivers as he had already seen those of the Indus, as well as the sea into which it flows. Some authors also have stated that he was meditating a voyage round the larger portion of Arabia, the country of the Ethiopians, Libya, i.e. Africa, and Numidia beyond Mount Atlas to Gadara, i.e. Cadiz, inward into our sea, i.e. the Mediterranean, thinking that after he had subdued both Libya and Carchedon, i.e. Carthage, he might with justice be called king of all Asia. For he said that the kings of the Persians and Medes called themselves great kings without any right, since they did not rule the larger part of Asia. Some say that he was meditating a voyage thence into the Euxine Sea, to Scythia and the Lake Meotis, i.e. the Sea of Azov, while others assert that he intended to go to Sicily and the Iapygian Cape, for the fame of the Romans spreading far and wide was now exciting his jealousy. For my own part, one cannot conjecture with any certainty what were his plans, and I do not care to guess. But this I think I can confidently affirm, that he meditated nothing small or mean, and that he would never have remained satisfied with any of the acquisitions he had made, even if he had added Europe to Asia or the islands of the Britons to Europe, but would still have gone on seeking for unknown lands beyond those mentioned. I verily believe that if he had found no one else to strive with, he would have striven with himself. And on this account, I commend some of the Indian philosophers, who are said to have been caught by Alexander as they were walking in the open meadow where they were accustomed to spend their time. At the sight of him and his army, they did nothing else but stamp with their feet on the earth, upon which they were stepping. When he asked them by means of interpreters what was the meaning of their action, they replied as follows: "O King Alexander, every man possesses as much of the earth as this upon which we have stepped, but thou being only a man like the rest of us, except in being meddlesome and arrogant, art come over so great a part of the earth from thy own land, giving trouble both to thyself and others. And yet thou also wilt soon die, and possess only as much of the earth as is sufficient for thy body to be buried in." Chapter 2. Alexander's Dealings with the Indian Sages. On this occasion, Alexander commended both the words and the men who spoke them, but nevertheless, he did just the opposite to that which he commended. When also in the isthmus he met Diogenes of Sinope, lying in the sun, standing near him with his shield-bearing guards and foot companions, he asked if he wanted anything. But Diogenes said that he wanted nothing else, except that he and his attendants would stand out of the sunlight. Alexander is said to have expressed his admiration of Diogenes's conduct. Thus it is evident that Alexander was not entirely destitute of better feelings, but he was the slave of his insatiable ambition. Again, when he arrived at Taxila and saw the naked sect of Indian philosophers, he was exceedingly desirous that one of these men should live with him, because he admired their power of endurance. But the oldest of the philosophers, Dandames by name, of whom the others were disciples, refused to come himself to Alexander, and would not allow the others to do so. He is said to have replied that he was himself a son of Zeus, if Alexander was, and that he wanted nothing from him because he was quite contented with what he had. And besides, he said that he saw his attendants wandering over so much of the land and see to no advantage, and that there was no end to their many wanderings. Therefore he had no desire that Alexander should give him anything which was in his own possession, nor on the other hand was he afraid that he should be excluded from anything which Alexander ruled over. For while he lived the country of India, which produces the fruits in their season, was sufficient for him, and when he died he should be released from the body, an unsuitable associate. Alexander then did not attempt to force him to come with him, considering that the man was free to do as he pleased. But Megasthenes has recorded that Calenus, one of the philosophers of this region, who had very little power over his desires, was induced to do so, and that the philosophers themselves reproached him for having deserted the happiness existing among them and serving another lord instead of the god. Chapter 3. Self-sacrifice of the Indian Calenus. This I have recorded, because in a history of Alexander it is necessary also to speak of Calenus. For when he was in the country of Persis his health became delicate, though he had never before been subject to illness. Accordingly, not being willing to lead the life of a man in infirm health, he told Alexander that in such circumstances he thought it best for him to put an end to his existence, before he came into experience of any disease which might compel him to change his former mode of living. For a long time the king tried to dissuade him. However, when he saw that he was not to be overcome, but would find some other way of release, if this were not yielded to him, he ordered a funeral pyre to be heaped up for him, in the place where the man himself directed, and gave instructions that Ptolemy, son of Lagus, the confidential bodyguard, should have the charge of it. They say that a solemn procession, consisting both of horses and men, advanced before him, some of the latter being armed and others carrying all kinds of incense for the pyre. They also say that they were carrying gold and silver goblets and royal apparel, and because he was unable to walk through illness, a horse was prepared for him. However, not being able to mount the horse, he was conveyed stretched out upon a litter, crowned with a garland after the custom of the Indians, and singing in the Indian language. The Indians say that he sang hymns to the gods and eulogiums on his countrymen. Before he ascended the funeral pyre, he presented the horse which he should himself have mounted, being a royal steed of the Nicaean breed, to Lysimachus, one of those who attended him to learn his philosophy. He distributed among his other disciples the goblets and rugs which Alexander had ordered to be cast into the pyre as an honor to him. Then mounting the pyre he lay down upon it in a becoming manner, and was visible to the whole army. To Alexander the spectacle appeared unseemly, as it was being exhibited at the cost of a friend, but to the rest it was a cause of wonder that he did not move any part of his body in the fire. As soon as the men to whom the duty had been assigned set fire to the pyre, Nearchus says the trumpet sounded, in accordance with Alexander's order, and the whole army raised the war cry as it was in the habit of shouting when advancing to battle. The elephants also chimed in with their shrill and warlike cry, in honor of Calenus. Authors upon whom reliance may be placed have recorded these and such-like things, facts of great import to those who are desirous of learning how steadfast and immovable a thing the human mind is in regard to what it wishes to accomplish. Chapter 4. Marriages between Macedonians and Persians. At this time, Alexander sent Atropates away to his own viceroyalty, after advancing to Susa, where he arrested Abulites and his son Oxathers, and put them to death on the ground that they were governing the Susians badly. Many outrages upon temples, tombs, and the subjects themselves had been committed by those who were ruling the countries conquered by Alexander in war. Because the king's expedition into India had taken a long time, and it was not thought credible that he would ever return in safety from so many nations possessing so many elephants, going to his destruction beyond the Indus, Hydaspes, Assassines, and Hiphasis. The calamities that befell him among the Gadrosians were still greater inducements to those acting as viceroys in this region to be free from apprehension of his return to his dominions. Not only so, but Alexander himself is said to have become more inclined at that time to believe accusations which were plausible in every way. as well as to inflict very severe punishment upon those who were convicted even of small offenses, because with the same disposition he thought they would be likely to perform great ones. In Susa also he celebrated both his own wedding and those of his companions. He himself married Barsine, the eldest daughter of Darius, and according to Aristobulus, besides her another, Parasates, the youngest daughter of Ochus. He had already married Roxana, daughter of Oxyartes the Bactrian. To Hephaestion he gave Dryptes, another daughter of Darius, and his own wife's sister, for he wished Hephaestion's children to be first cousins to his own. To Craterus he gave Amastrine, daughter of Oxyartes the brother of Darius. To Perdiccas, the daughter of Atropates, viceroy of Media. To Ptolemy the confidential bodyguard, and Eumenes the royal secretary, the daughters of Artabazus, to the former Artacama, and to the latter Artenis. To Nearchus he gave the daughter of Barsine and Mentor, to Seleucus the daughter of Spitamenes the Bactrian. Likewise to the rest of his companions he gave the choicest daughters of the Persians and Medes, to the number of 80. The weddings were celebrated after the Persian manner, seats being placed in a row for the bridegrooms, and after the banquet the brides came in and seated themselves, each one near her own husband. The bridegrooms took them by the right hand and kissed them, the king being the first to begin, for the weddings of all were conducted in the same way. This appeared the most popular thing which Alexander ever did, and it proved his affection for his companions. Each man took his own bride and led her away, and on all without exception Alexander bestowed dowries. He also ordered that the names of all the other Macedonians who had married any of the Asiatic women should be registered. They were over 10,000 in number, and to these Alexander made presents on account of their weddings. Chapter 5. The soldiers rewarded. He now thought it a favorable opportunity to liquidate the debts of all the soldiers who had incurred them, and for this purpose he ordered that a register should be made of how much each man owed, in order that they might receive the money. At first, only a few registered their names, fearing that this was being instituted as a test by Alexander, to discover which of the soldiers found their pay insufficient for their expenses, and which of them were extravagant in their mode of living. When he was informed that most of them were not registering their names, but that those who had borrowed money on bonds were concealing the fact, he reproached them for their distrust of him. For he said that it was not right either that the king should deal otherwise than sincerely with his subjects, or that any of those ruled by him should think that he would deal otherwise than sincerely with them. Accordingly, he had tables placed in the camp with money upon them, and he appointed men to manage the distribution of it. He ordered the debts of all who showed a money bond to be liquidated without the debtors' names being any longer registered. Consequently, the men believed that Alexander was dealing sincerely with them, and the fact that they were not known was a greater pleasure to them than the fact that they ceased to be in debt. This presentation to the army is said to have amounted to 20,000 talents. He also gave presents to particular individuals, according as each man was held in honor for his merit or valor if he had become conspicuous in crises of danger. Those who were distinguished for their personal gallantry he crowned with golden chaplets. First, Pusestes, the man who had held the shield over him. Second, Leonetus, who also had held his shield over him, and moreover had incurred dangers in India and won a victory in Ora. For he had posted himself with the forces left with him against the Oricians and the tribes living near them, who were trying to effect a revolution, and had conquered them in battle. He also seemed to have managed other affairs in Ora with great success. In addition to these, he crowned Nearchus for his successful voyage round the coast from the land of the Indians through the Great Sea, for this officer had now arrived at Susa. Besides these three, he crowned Onesicritus, the pilot of the royal ship, as well as Hephaestion and the rest of the confidential bodyguards. Chapter 6. An army of Asiatics trained under the Macedonian discipline. The viceroys from the newly built cities and the rest of the territory, subdued in war, came to him, bringing with them youths just growing into manhood to the number of 30,000, all of the same age, whom Alexander called epigoni, successors. They were accoutred with Macedonian arms and exercised in military discipline after the Macedonian system. The arrival of these is said to have vexed the Macedonians, who thought that Alexander was contriving every means in his power to free himself from his previous need of their services. For the same reason, also the sight of his Median dress was no small cause of dissatisfaction to them, and the weddings celebrated in the Persian fashion were displeasing to most of them, even including some of those who married, although they had been greatly honored by the king putting himself on the same level with them in the marriage ceremony. They were offended at Pusestas, the viceroy of Persis, on account of his Persianizing both in dress and in speech, because the king was delighted by his adopting the Asiatic customs. They were disgusted that the Bactrian Sogdianian, Aracosian, Zarangian, Arrian, and Parthian horsemen, as well as the Persian horsemen called the Avaki, were distributed among the squadrons of the companion cavalry, as many of them at least as were seen to excel in reputation, fineness of stature, or any other good quality, and that a fifth cavalry division was added to these troops, not composed entirely of foreigners. But the whole body of cavalry was increased in number, and men were picked from the foreigners and put into it. Cophon, son of Artabazus, Hydarnes and Artaboles, sons of Mazius, Sicines and Phratesmenes, sons of Phrataphornes, viceroy of Parthia and Hyrcania, Histanes, son of Oxyartes and brother of Alexander's wife, Roxane, as well as Autobares and his brother Mithribius were picked out and enrolled among the foot guard in addition to the Macedonian officers. Over these histasps, the Bactrian was placed as commander, and Macedonian spears were given to them instead of the barbarian javelins which had thongs attached to them. All this offended the Macedonians, who thought that Alexander was becoming altogether Asiatic in his ideas, and was holding the Macedonians themselves, as well as their customs, in a position of contempt. Chapter 7. Navigation of the Tigris. Alexander now ordered Hephaestion to lead the main body of the infantry as far as the Persian Sea, while he himself, his fleet having sailed up into the land of Susiana, embarked with the shield-bearing guards and the bodyguard of infantry. And having also put on board a few of the cavalry companions, he sailed down the river Iulius to the sea. When he was near the place where the river discharges itself into the deep, he left there most of his ships, including those which were in need of repair. And with those especially adapted for fast sailing, he coasted along out of the river Iulius through the sea to the mouth of the Tigris. The rest of the ships were conveyed down the Iulius as far as the canal which has been cut from the Tigris into the Iulius, and by this means they were brought into the Tigris. Of the rivers Euphrates and Tigris which enclose Syria between them, whence also its name is called by the natives Mesopotamia, the Tigris flows in a much lower channel than the Euphrates, from which it receives many canals. And after taking up many tributaries and its waters being swelled by them, it falls into the Persian Sea. It is a large river and can be crossed on foot nowhere as far as its mouth, inasmuch as none of its water is used up by irrigation of the country. For the land through which it flows is more elevated than its water, and it is not drawn off into canals or into another river, but rather receives them into itself. It is nowhere possible to irrigate the land from it. But the Euphrates flows in an elevated channel and is everywhere on a level with the land through which it passes. Many canals have been made from it, some of which are always kept flowing, and from which the inhabitants on both banks supply themselves with water. Others the people make only when requisite to irrigate the land when they are in need of water from drought. For this country is usually free from rain. The consequence is that the Euphrates at last has only a small volume of water, which disappears into a marsh. Alexander sailed over the sea round the shore of the Persian Gulf, lying between the rivers Iulius and Tigris, and thence he sailed up the latter river as far as the camp where Hephaestion had settled with all his forces. Thence he sailed again to Opis, a city situated on that river. In his voyage up, he destroyed the weirs which existed in the river, and thus made the stream quite level. These weirs had been constructed by the Persians to prevent any enemy having a superior naval force from sailing up from the sea into their country. The Persians had had recourse to these contrivances because they were not a nautical people, and thus, by making an unbroken succession of weirs, they had rendered the voyage up the Tigris a matter of impossibility. But Alexander said that such devices were unbecoming to men who are victorious in battle, and therefore he considered this means of safety unsuitable for him. And by easily demolishing the laborious work of the Persians, he proved in fact that what they thought a protection was unworthy of the name. Chapter 8. the Macedonians offended at Alexander. When he arrived at Opis, he collected the Macedonians and announced that he intended to discharge from the army those who were useless for military service, either from age or from being maimed in the limbs, and he said he would send them back to their own abodes. He also promised to give those who went back as much as would make them special objects of envy to those at home, and arouse in the other Macedonians the wish to share similar dangers and labors. Alexander said this, no doubt, for the purpose of pleasing the Macedonians, but on the contrary they were, not without reason, offended by the speech which he delivered, thinking that now they were despised by him and deemed to be quite useless for military service. Indeed, throughout the whole of this expedition, they had been offended at many other things. For his adoption of the Persian dress, thereby exhibiting his contempt for their opinion, caused them grief, as did also his accoutring the foreign soldiers called epigoni in the Macedonian style, and the mixing of the alien horsemen among the ranks of the companions. Therefore they could not remain silent and control themselves, but urged him to dismiss all of them from his army. And they advised him to prosecute the war in company with his father, deriding Ammon by this remark. When Alexander heard this, for at that time he was more hasty in temper than heretofore, and no longer, as of old, indulgent to the Macedonians from having a retinue of foreign attendants, leaping down from the platform with his officers around him, he ordered the most conspicuous of the men who had tried to stir up the multitude to sedition to be arrested. He himself pointed out with his hand to the shield-bearing guards those whom they were to arrest, to the number of 13, and he ordered these to be led away to execution. When the rest, stricken with terror, became silent, he mounted the platform and spoke as follows. Chapter 9. Alexander's speech. The speech which I am about to deliver will not be for the purpose of checking your start homeward, for, so far as I am concerned, you may depart wherever you wish, but because I wish you to know what kind of men you were originally and how you have been transformed since you came into our service. In the first place, as is reasonable, I shall begin my speech from my father Philip. For he found you vagabonds and destitute of means, most of you clad in hides, feeding a few sheep up the mountainsides, for the protection of which you had to fight with small success against Illyrians, Tribalians, and the border Thracians. Instead of the hides, he gave you cloaks to wear, and from the mountains he led you down into the plains, and made you capable of fighting the neighboring barbarians, so that you were no longer compelled to preserve yourselves by trusting rather to the inaccessible strongholds than to your own valor. He made you colonists of cities, which he adorned with useful laws and customs, and from being slaves and subjects, he made you rulers over those very barbarians by whom you yourselves, as well as your property, were previously liable to be plundered and ravaged. He also added the greater part of Thrace to Macedonia, and by seizing the most conveniently situated places on the seacoast, he spread abundance over the land from commerce, and made the working of the mines a secure employment. He made you rulers over the Thessalians, of whom you had formerly been in mortal fear. And by humbling the nation of the Phocians, he rendered the avenue into Greece broad and easy for you, instead of being narrow and difficult. The Athenians and Thebans, who were always lying in wait to attack Macedonia, he humbled to such a degree. I also then rendering him my personal aid in the campaign, that instead of paying tribute to the former and being vassals to the latter, those states in their turn procure security to themselves by our assistance. He penetrated into the Peloponnese, and after regulating its affairs, was publicly declared commander-in-chief of all the rest of Greece in the expedition against the Persian, adding this glory not more to himself than to the commonwealth of the Macedonians. These were the advantages which accrued to you from my father Philip, great indeed if looked at by themselves, but small if compared with those you have obtained from me. For though I inherited from my father only a few gold and silver goblets, and there were not even 60 talents in the treasury, and though I found myself charged with a debt of 500 talents owing by Philip, and I was obliged myself to borrow 800 talents in addition to these, I started from the country which could not decently support you, and forthwith laid open to you the passage of the Hellespont, though at that time the Persians held the sovereignty of the sea. Having overpowered the viceroys of Darius with my cavalry, I added to your empire the whole of Ionia, the whole of Elis, both Phrygias and Lydia, and I took Miletus by siege. All the other places I gained by voluntary surrender, and I granted you the privilege of appropriating the wealth found in them. The riches of Egypt and Cyrene, which I acquired without fighting a battle, have come to you. Seal Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia are your property. Babylon, Bactria, and Susa are yours. The wealth of the Lydians, the treasures of the Persians, and the riches of the Indians are yours, and so is the external sea. You are viceroys, you are generals, you are captains. What then have I reserved to myself after all these labors, except this purple robe and this diadem? I have appropriated nothing myself, nor can any one point out my treasures, except these possessions of yours or the things which I am guarding on your behalf. Individually, however, I have no motive to guard them, since I feed on the same fare as you do, and I take only the same amount of sleep. Nay, I do not think that my fare is as good as that of those among you who live luxuriously, and I know that I often sit up at night to watch for you, that you may be able to sleep. Chapter 10. Alexander's speech continued. But someone may say that while you endured toil and fatigue, I have acquired these things as your leader without myself sharing the toil and fatigue. But who is there of you who knows that he has endured greater toil for me than I have for him? Come now. Whoever of you has wounds, let him strip and show them, and I will show mine in turn, for there is no part of my body, in front at any rate, remaining free from wounds. Nor is there any kind of weapon used either for close combat or for hurling at the enemy, the traces of which I do not bear on my person. For I have been wounded with the sword in close fight, I have been shot with arrows, and I have been struck with missiles projected from engines of war. And though oftentimes I have been hit with stones and bolts of wood for the sake of your lives, your glory, and your wealth, I am still leading you as conquerors over all the land and sea, all rivers, mountains, and plains. I have celebrated your weddings with my own, and the children of many of you will be akin to my children. Moreover, I have liquidated the debts of all those who had incurred them, without inquiring too closely for what purpose they were contracted, though you receive such high pay, and carry off so much booty whenever there is booty to be got after a siege. Most of you have golden crowns, the eternal memorials of your valor, and of the honor you receive from me. Whoever has been killed has met with a glorious end and has been honored with a splendid burial. Brazen statues of most of the slain have been erected at home, and their parents are held in honor, being released from all public service and from taxation. But no one of you has ever been killed in flight under my leadership. And now I was intending to send back those of you who are unfit for service, objects of envy to those at home. But since you all wish to depart, depart all of you. Go back and report at home that your king Alexander, the conqueror of the Persians, Medes, Bactrians, and Sacians, the man who has subjugated the Uxians, Arachosians, and Drangians, who has also acquired the rule of the Parthians, Chorasmians, and Hyrcanians as far as the Caspian Sea, who has marched over the Caucasus, through the Caspian gates, who has crossed the rivers Oxus and Tanais, and the Indus besides, which has never been crossed by anyone else except Dionysus, who has also crossed the Hydaspes, Acessanes, and Hydriots, and who would have crossed the Hyphasis if you had not shrunk back with alarm, who has penetrated into the great sea by both the mouths of the Indus, who has marched through the desert of Gadrosia, where no one ever before marched with an army, who on his route acquired possession of Carmania and the land of the Oricians, in addition to his other conquests, his fleet having in the meantime already sailed round the coast of the sea which extends from India to Persia. Report that when you returned to Susa you deserted him and went away, handing him over to the protection of conquered foreigners. Perhaps this report of yours will be both glorious to you in the eyes of men and devout forsooth in the eyes of the gods. Depart. Chapter 11. Reconciliation between Alexander and his army. Having thus spoken, he leaped down quickly from the platform and entered the palace, where he paid no attention to the decoration of his person, nor was any of his companions admitted to see him. Not even on the morrow was any one of them admitted to an audience. But on the third day he summoned the select Persians within, and among them he distributed the commands of the brigades, and made the rule that only those whom he had proclaimed his kinsmen should have the honor of saluting him with a kiss. But the Macedonians who heard the speech were thoroughly astonished at the moment, and remained there in silence near the platform, nor when he retired did any of them accompany the king, except his personal companions and the confidential bodyguards. Though they remained, most of them had nothing to do or say, and yet they were unwilling to retire. But when the news was reported to them about the Persians and Medes, that the military commands were being given to Persians, that the foreign soldiers were being selected and divided into companies, that a Persian foot guard, Persian foot companions, a Persian regiment of men with silver shields, as well as the cavalry companions, and another royal regiment of cavalry distinct from these, were being called by Macedonian names, they were no longer able to restrain themselves. But running in a body to the palace, they cast their weapons there in front of the gates as a sign of supplication to the king. Standing in front of the gates, they shouted, beseeching to be allowed to enter, and saying that they were willing to surrender the men who had been the instigators of the disturbance on that occasion and those who had begun the clamor. They also declared they would not retire from the gates either day or night, unless Alexander would take some pity upon them. When he was informed of this, he came out without delay, and seeing them lying on the ground in humble guise, and hearing most of them lamenting with loud voice, tears began to flow also from his own eyes. He made an effort to say something to them, but they continued their importunate entreaties. At length one of them, Collins by name, a man conspicuous both for his age and because he was captain of the companion cavalry, spoke as follows. "O king, what grieves the Macedonians is, that thou hast already made some of the Persians kinsmen to thyself, and that Persians are called Alexander's kinsmen, and have the honor of saluting thee with a kiss, whereas none of the Macedonians have as yet enjoyed this honor." Then Alexander, interrupting him, said, "But all of you without exception I consider my kinsmen, and so from this time I shall call you." When he had said this, Collins advanced and saluted him with a kiss, and so did all those who wished to salute him. Then they took up their weapons and returned to the camp, shouting and singing a song of thanksgiving to Apollo. After this Alexander offered sacrifice to the gods to whom it was his custom to sacrifice, and gave a public banquet, over which he himself presided, with the Macedonians sitting around him, and next to them the Persians, after whom came the men of the other nations, honored for their personal rank or for some meritorious action. The king and his guests drew wine from the same bowl and poured out the same libations, both the Grecian prophets and the Magians commencing the ceremony. He prayed for other blessings, and especially that harmony and community of rule might exist between the Macedonians and Persians. The common account is that those who took part in this banquet were 9,000 in number, that all of them poured out one libation, and after it sang a song of thanksgiving to Apollo. Chapter 12. 10,000 Macedonians sent home with Craterus. Disputes between Antipater and Olympias. Then those of the Macedonians who were unfit for service on account of age or any other misfortune went back of their own accord, to the number of about 10,000. To these Alexander gave the pay not only for the time which had already elapsed, but also for that which they would spend in returning home. He also gave to each man a talent in addition to his pay. If any of them had children by Asiatic wives, he ordered them to leave them behind with him, lest they should introduce into Macedonia a cause of discord, taking with them children by foreign women who were of a different race from the children whom they had left behind at home born of Macedonian mothers. He promised to take care that they should be brought up as Macedonians, educating them not only in general matters, but also in the art of war. He also undertook to lead them into Macedonia when they arrived at manhood, and hand them over to their fathers. These uncertain and obscure promises were made to them as they were departing, and he thought he was giving a most indubitable proof of the friendship and affection he had for them by sending with them, as their guardian and the leader of the expedition, Craterus, the man most faithful to him, and whom he valued equally with himself. Then, having saluted them all, he with tears dismissed them, likewise weeping from his presence. He ordered Craterus to lead these men back, and when he had done so, to take upon himself the government of Macedonia, Thrace, and Thessaly, and to preside over the freedom of the Greeks. He also ordered Antipater to bring to him the Macedonians of manly age as successors to those who were being sent back. He dispatched Polysperchon also with Craterus, as his second in command, so that if any mishap befell Craterus on the march, for he was sending him back on account of the weakness of his health, those who were going might not be in need of a general. A secret report was also going about that Alexander was now overcome by his mother's accusations of Antipater, and that he wished to remove him from Macedonia. This report was current among those who thought that royal actions are more worthy of honor in proportion to their secrecy, and who were inclined to impute what is worthy of belief to a bad motive rather than to attribute it to the real one, a course to which they were led by appearances and their own depravity. But probably this sending for Antipater was not designed for his dishonor, but rather to prevent any unpleasant consequences to Antipater and Olympias from their quarrel which he might not himself be able to rectify. For they were incessantly writing to Alexander, the former saying that the arrogance, acerbity, and meddlesomeness of Olympias was exceedingly unbecoming to the king's mother, insomuch that Alexander was related to have used the following remark in reference to the reports which he received about his mother, that she was exacting from him a heavy house rent for the 10 months. The queen wrote that Antipater was overweeningly insolent in his pretensions and in the service of his court, no longer remembering the one who had appointed him, but claiming to win and hold the first rank among the Macedonians and Greeks. These slanderous reports about Antipater appeared to have more weight with Alexander, since they were more formidable in regard to the regal dignity. However, no overt act or word of the king was reported, from which anyone could infer that Antipater was in any way less in favor with him than before. Chapter 13. The Nicaean Plain, the Amazons. It is said that Hephaestion much against his will yielded to this argument and was reconciled to Eumenes, who on his part wished to settle the dispute. In this journey, Alexander is said to have seen the plain which was devoted to the royal mares. Herodotus says that the plain itself was named Nicaean, and that the mares were called Nicaean, adding that in olden times there were 150,000 of these horses. But at this time, Alexander found not many above 50,000, for most of them had been carried off by robbers. They say that Atropates, the viceroy of Media, gave him 100 women, saying that they were of the race of Amazons. These had been equipped with the arms of male horsemen, except that they carried axes instead of spears and targets instead of shields. They also say that they had the right breast smaller than the left, and that they exposed it in battle. Alexander dismissed them from the army, that no attempt to violate them might be made by the Macedonians or barbarians, and he ordered them to carry word to their queen that he was coming to her in order to procreate children by her. But this story has been recorded neither by Aristobulus nor Ptolemy, nor any other writer who is a trustworthy authority on such matters. I do not even think that the race of Amazons was surviving at that time, for before Alexander's time they were not mentioned even by Xenophon, who mentions the Phasians, Colchians, and all the other barbaric races which the Greeks came upon, when they started from Trapezus or before they marched down to Trapezus. They would certainly have fallen in with the Amazons if they were still in existence. However, it does not seem to me credible that this race of women was altogether fictitious, because it has been celebrated by so many famous poets. For the general account is that Heracles marched against them and brought the girdle of their queen Hippolyte into Greece. The Athenians, also under Theseus, were the first to conquer and repulse these women as they were advancing into Europe, and the battle of the Athenians and Amazons has been painted by Micon, no less than that of the Athenians and Persians. Herodotus also has frequently written about these women, and so have the Athenian writers who have honored the men who perished in war with funeral orations. They have mentioned the exploit of the Athenians against the Amazons as one of their special glories. If therefore Atropates showed any equestrian women to Alexander, I think he must have shown him some other foreign women trained in horsemanship and equipped with the arms which were said to be those of the Amazons. Chapter 14. Death of Hephaestion. In Ecbatana, Alexander offered sacrifice according to his custom, for good fortune, and he celebrated a gymnastic and musical contest. He also held drinking parties with his companions. At this time, Hephaestion fell sick, and they say that the stadium was full of people on the 7th day of his fever, for on that day there was a gymnastic contest for boys. When Alexander was informed that Hephaestion was in a critical state, he went to him without delay, but found him no longer alive. Different authors have given different accounts of Alexander's grief on this occasion, but they agree in this, that his grief was great. As to what was done in honor of Hephaestion, they make diverse statements, just as each writer was actuated by goodwill or envy towards him, or even towards Alexander himself. Of the authors who have made these reckless statements, some seem to me to have thought that whatever Alexander said or did to show his excessive grief for the man who was the dearest to him in the world redounds to his own honor, whereas others seem to have thought that it rather tended to his disgrace, as being conduct unbecoming to any king and especially to Alexander. Some say that he lay prostrate on his companion's body for the greater part of that day, bewailing him and refusing to depart from him until he was forcibly carried away by his companions. Others that he lay upon the body the whole day and night. Others again say that he hanged the physician Glaucias for having indiscreetly given the medicine, while others affirm that he, being a spectator of the games, neglected Hephaestion, who was filled with wine. That Alexander should have cut off his hair in honor of the dead man, I do not think improbable, both for other reasons and especially from a desire to imitate Achilles, whom from his boyhood he had an ambition to rival. Others also say that Alexander himself at one time drove the chariot on which the body was borne, but this statement I by no means believe. Others again affirm that he ordered the shrine of Asclepius in Ecbatana to be razed to the ground, which was an act of barbarism, and by no means in harmony with Alexander's general behavior, but rather in accordance with the arrogance of Xerxes in his dealings with the deity, who is said to have let fetters down into the Hellespont in order to punish it forsooth. But the following statement, which has been recorded, does not seem to me entirely beyond the range of probability: that when Alexander was marching to Babylon, he was met on the road by many embassies from Greece, among which were some Epidaurian envoys, who obtained from him their requests. He also gave them an offering to be conveyed to Asclepius, adding this remark: "Although Asclepius has not treated me fairly in not saving the life of my companion, whom I valued equally with my own head." It has been stated by most writers that he ordered honors to be always paid to Hephaestion as a hero, and some say that he even sent men to Ammon's temple to ask the god if it were allowable to offer sacrifice to Hephaestion as a god. But Ammon replied that it was not allowable. All the authorities, however, agree as to the following facts: that until the third day after Hephaestion's death, Alexander neither tasted food nor paid any attention to his personal appearance, but lay on the ground either bewailing or silently mourning; that he also ordered a funeral pyre to be prepared for him in Babylon at the expense of 10,000 talents. Some say, at a still greater cost, that a decree was published throughout all the barbarian territory for the observance of a public mourning. Many of Alexander's companions dedicated themselves and their arms to the dead Hephaestion in order to show their respect to him, and the first to begin the artifice was Eumenes, whom we a short time ago mentioned as having been at variance with him. This he did that Alexander might not think he was pleased at Hephaestion's death. Alexander did not appoint anyone else to be commander of the companion cavalry in the place of Hephaestion, so that the name of that general might not perish from the brigade. But that division of cavalry was still called Hephaestion, and the figure made from Hephaestion went in front of it. He also resolved to celebrate a gymnastic and musical contest, much more magnificent than any of the preceding, both in the multitude of competitors and in the amount of money expended upon it. For he provided 3,000 competitors in all, and it is said that these men, a short time after, also competed in the games held at Alexander's own funeral. Chapter 15. Subjugation of the Cassians, embassies from distant nations. The mourning was prolonged for many days, and as he was now beginning to recall himself from it, under such circumstances his companions had less difficulty in rousing him to action. Then at length he made an expedition against the Cassians, a warlike race bordering on the territory of the Uxians. They are mountaineers, inhabiting strong positions in separate villages. Whenever a force approached them, they were in the habit of retiring to the summits of their mountains, either in a body or separately as each man found it practicable, and thus they escaped, making it difficult for those who attacked them with their forces to come near them. After the enemy's departure, they used to turn themselves again to marauding, by which occupation they supported themselves. But Alexander subdued this race, though he marched against them in the winter, for neither winter nor ruggedness of ground was any impediment either to him or to Ptolemy, son of Lagus, who led a part of the army in the campaign against them. Thus, no military enterprise which Alexander undertook was ever unsuccessful. As he was marching back to Babylon, he was met by embassies from the Libyans, who congratulated him and crowned him as conqueror of the kingdom of Asia. From Italy also came Bruttians, Lucanians, and Tyrrhenians as envoys, for the same purpose. The Carthaginians are said to have sent an embassy to him at this time, and it is also asserted that envoys came to request his friendship from the Ethiopians, the Scythians of Europe, the Gauls, and Iberians, nations whose names were heard, and their accoutrements seen then for the first time by Greeks and Macedonians. They are also said to have entrusted to Alexander the duty of settling their disputes with each other. Then indeed it was especially evident both to himself and to those about him that he was lord of all the land and sea. Of the men who have written the history of Alexander, Aristus and Asclepiades alone say that the Romans also sent an embassy to him, and that when he met their embassy, he predicted something of the future power of Rome, observing both the attire of the men, their love of labor, and their devotion to freedom. At the same time, he made urgent inquiries about their political constitution. This incident I have recorded neither as certainly authentic nor as altogether incredible. But none of the Roman writers have made any mention of this embassy having been dispatched to Alexander, nor of those who have written an account of Alexander's actions has either Ptolemy, son of Lagus, or Aristobulus mentioned it. With these authors, I am generally inclined to agree. Nor does it seem likely that the Roman Republic, which was at that time remarkable for its love of liberty, would send an embassy to a foreign king, especially to a place so far away from their own land, when they were not compelled to do so by fear or any hope of advantage, being possessed as they were beyond any other people by hatred to the very name and race of despots. Chapter 16. Exploration of the Caspian, the Chaldean soothsayers. After this, Alexander sent Heraclides, son of Argeus, into Hyrcania in command of a company of shipwrights, with orders to cut timber from the Hyrcanian mountains and with it to construct a number of ships of war, some without decks and others with decks after the Grecian fashion of shipbuilding. For he was very desirous of discovering with what sea the one called the Hyrcanian or Caspian unites, whether it communicates with the water of the Euxine Sea, or whether the Great Sea comes right round from the Eastern Sea, which is near India and flows up into the Hyrcanian Gulf, just as he had discovered that the Persian Sea, which was called the Red Sea, is really a gulf of the Great Sea. For the sources of the Caspian Sea had not yet been discovered, although many nations dwell around it, and navigable rivers discharge their waters into it. From Bactria, the Oxus, the largest of Asiatic rivers, those of India excepted, discharges itself into this sea, and through Scythia flows the Jaxartes. The general account is that the Araxes also, which flows from Armenia, falls into the same sea. These are the largest, but many others flow into these, while others again discharge themselves directly into this sea. Some of these were known to those who visited these nations with Alexander. Others are situated towards the farther side of the Gulf, as it seems, in the country of the nomadic Scythians, a district which is quite unknown. When Alexander had crossed the river to graze with his army and was marching to Babylon, he was met by the Chaldean philosophers, who, having led him away from his companions, besought him to suspend his march to that city. For they said that an oracular declaration had been made to them by the god Belus, that his entrance into Babylon at that time would not be for his good. But he answered their speech with a line from the poet Euripides to this effect: "He the best prophet is that guesses well." But said the Chaldeans, "O king, do not at any rate enter the city looking towards the west, nor leading the army advancing in that direction, but rather go right round towards the east." But this did not turn out to be easy for him, on account of the difficulty of the ground, for the deity was leading him to the place where entering he was doomed soon to die. And perhaps it was better for him to be taken off in the very acme of his glory, as well as of the affection entertained for him by men, before any of the vicissitudes natural to man befell him. Probably this was the reason Solon advised Croesus to look at the end of a long life, and not before pronounce any man happy. Yea, indeed, Hephaestion's death had been no small misfortune to Alexander, and I think he would rather have departed before it occurred than have been alive to experience it. No less than Achilles, as it seems to me, would rather have died before Patroclus than have been the avenger of his death. Chapter 17. The advice of the Chaldees rejected. But he had a suspicion that the Chaldeans were trying to prevent his entrance into Babylon at that time, with reference rather to their own advantage than to the declaration of the oracle. For in the middle of the city of the Babylonians was the temple of Belus, an edifice very great in size, constructed of baked bricks which were cemented together with bitumen. This temple had been razed to the ground by Xerxes when he returned from Greece, as were also all the other sacred buildings of the Babylonians. Some say that Alexander had formed the resolution to rebuild it upon the former foundations, and for this reason he ordered the Babylonians to carry away the mound. Others say that he intended to build a still larger one than that which formerly existed. But after his departure, the men who had been entrusted with the work prosecuted it without any vigor, so that he determined to employ the whole of his army in completing it. A great quantity of land as well as gold had been dedicated to the god Belus by the Assyrian kings, and in olden times the temple was kept in repair and sacrifices were offered to the god. But at that time, the Chaldeans were appropriating the property of the god, since nothing existed upon which the revenues could be expended. Alexander suspected that they did not wish him to enter Babylon for this reason, for fear that in a short time the temple would be finished, and they should be deprived of the gains accruing from the money. And yet, according to Aristobulus, he was willing to yield to their persuasions so far at least as to change the direction of his entry into the city. For this purpose, on the first day he encamped near the river Euphrates, and on the next day he marched along the bank, keeping the river on his right hand, with the intention of passing beyond the part of the city turned towards the west, and there wheeling round to lead his army towards the east. But on account of the difficulty of the ground he could not march with his army in this direction, because if a man who is entering the city from the west here changes his direction eastward, he comes upon ground covered with marshes and shoals. Thus, partly by his own will and partly against his will, he disobeyed the god. Chapter 18. Predictions of Alexander's death. Moreover, Aristobulus has recorded the following story. Apollodorus, the Amphipolitan, one of Alexander's companions, was general of the army which the king left with Mazius, the viceroy of Babylon. When he joined his forces with the king, on the return of the latter from India, and observed that he was severely punishing the viceroys who had been placed over the several countries, he sent to his brother Pythagoras and asked him to divine about his safety. For Pythagoras was a diviner who derived his knowledge of the future from the inspection of the inward parts of animals. This man sent back to Apollodorus, inquiring of whom he was so especially afraid as to wish to consult divination. The latter wrote back, the king himself and Hephaestion. Pythagoras therefore in the first place offered sacrifice with reference to Hephaestion. But as there was no lobe visible upon the liver of the sacrificial victim, he stated this fact in a letter, which he sealed and sent to his brother from Babylon to Ecbatana, explaining that there was no reason at all to be afraid of Hephaestion, for in a short time he would be out of their way. And Aristobulus says that Apollodorus received this epistle only one day before Hephaestion died. Then Pythagoras again offered sacrifice in respect to Alexander, and the liver of the victim consulted in respect to him was also destitute of a lobe. He therefore wrote to Apollodorus to the same purport about Alexander as about Hephaestion. Apollodorus did not conceal the information sent to him, but told Alexander, in order the more to show his goodwill to the king, if he urged him to be on his guard, lest some danger might befall him at that time. And Aristobulus says that the king commended Apollodorus, and when he entered Babylon, he asked Pythagoras what sign he had met with, to induce him to write thus to his brother. He said that the liver of the victim sacrificed for him was without a lobe. When Alexander asked what the sign portended, he said that it was a very disastrous one. The king was so far from being angry with him that he even treated him with greater respect, for telling him the truth without any disguise. Aristobulus says that he himself heard this story from Pythagoras, and adds that the same man acted as diviner for Perdiccas and afterwards for Antigonus, and that the same sign occurred for both. It was verified by fact, for Perdiccas lost his life leading an army against Ptolemy, and Antigonus was killed in the battle fought by him at Ipsus against Seleucus and Lysimachus. Also concerning Calenus, the Indian philosopher, the following story has been recorded. When he was going to the funeral pyre to die, he gave the parting salutation to all his other companions, but he refused to approach Alexander to give him the salutation, saying he would meet him at Babylon and there salute him. At the time, indeed, this remark was treated with neglect. But afterwards, when Alexander had died at Babylon, it came to the recollection of those who had heard it, and they thought forsooth that it was a divine intimation of Alexander's approaching end. Chapter 19. Embassies from Greece, fleet prepared for invading Arabia. As he was entering Babylon, he was met by embassies from the Greeks, but for what purpose each embassy was sent has not been recorded. To me, indeed, it seems probable that most of them came to crown and eulogize him on account of his victories, especially the Indian ones, as well as to say that the Greeks rejoiced at his safe return from India. It is said that he greeted these men with the right hand, and after paying them suitable honor sent them back. He also gave the ambassadors permission to take with them all the statues of men and images of gods and the other votive offerings, which Xerxes had carried off from Greece to Babylon, Pasargadae, Susa, or any other place in Asia. In this way, it is said that the brazen statues of Harmodius and Aristogiton, as well as the monument of the Seleucian Artemis, were carried back to Athens. Aristobulus says that he found at Babylon the fleet with Nearchus, which had sailed from the Persian Sea up the river Euphrates, and another which had been conveyed from Phoenicia, consisting of 2 Phoenician quinquiremes, 3 quadriremes, 12 triremes, and 30 triacontors. These had been taken to pieces and conveyed to the river Euphrates from Phoenicia to the city of Thapsacus. There they were joined together again and sailed down to Babylon. The same writer says that he cut down the cypresses in Babylonia and with them built another fleet. For in the land of the Assyrians, these trees alone are abundant, but of the other things necessary for shipbuilding this country affords no supply. A multitude of purple fishers and other seafaring men came to him from Phoenicia and the rest of the seaboard to serve as crews for the ships and perform the other services on board. Near Babylon, he made a harbor by excavation large enough to afford anchorage to 1,000 ships of war, and adjoining the harbor he made dockyards. Michaelis, the Clazomenian, was dispatched to Phoenicia and Syria with 500 talents to enlist some men and to purchase others who were experienced in nautical affairs. For Alexander designed to colonize the seaboard near the Persian Gulf, as well as the islands in that sea, for he thought that this land would become no less prosperous than Phoenicia. He made these preparations of the fleet to attack the main body of the Arabs, under the pretext that they were the only barbarians of this region who had not sent an embassy to him or done anything else becoming their position and showing respect to him. But the truth was, as it seems to me, that Alexander was insatiably ambitious of acquiring fresh territory. Chapter 20. Description of Arabia, Voyage of Nearchus. The common report is that he heard that the Arabs venerated only 2 gods, Uranus and Dionysus. The former because he is visible and contains in himself the heavenly luminaries, especially the sun, from which emanates the greatest and most evident benefit to all things human, and the latter on account of the fame he acquired by his expedition into India. Therefore he thought himself quite worthy to be considered by the Arabs as a 3rd god, since he had performed deeds by no means inferior to those of Dionysus. If then he could conquer the Arabs, he intended to grant them the privilege of conducting their government according to their own customs, as he had already done to the Indians. The fertility of the land was a secret inducement to him to invade it, because he heard that the people obtained cassia from the lakes and myrrh and frankincense from the trees, that cinnamon was cut from the shrubs, and that the meadows produced spikenard without any cultivation. As to the size of the country, he was informed that the seaboard of Arabia was not less in extent than that of India, that near it lie many islands, that in all parts of the country there were harbors sufficiently commodious to provide anchorage for his fleet, and that it supplied sites for founding cities, which would become flourishing. He was also informed that there were 2 islands in the sea facing the mouth of the Euphrates, the first of which was not far from the place where the waters of that river are discharged into the sea, being about 120 stads distant from the shore and the river's mouth. This is the smaller of the 2, and was densely covered with every kind of timber. In it was also a temple of Artemis, around which the inhabitants themselves spent their lives. The island was devoted to the use of wild goats and stags, which were allowed to range at large as being dedicated to Artemis. It was unlawful to chase them unless anyone wished to offer sacrifice to the goddess, and for this purpose alone it was lawful to chase them. Aristobulus says that Alexander ordered this island to be called Icarus, after the island so named in the Aegean Sea, on which, as the report goes, Icarus, son of Daedalus, fell when the wax, by which the wings had been fastened to him, melted. For he did not fly near the earth, according to his father's injunctions, but senselessly flying far aloft, he allowed the sun to soften and loosen the wax. Icarus left his name to the island and the sea, the former being called Icarus and the latter the Icarian. The other island was said to be distant from the mouth of the Euphrates, about a day and night's voyage for a ship running before the breeze. Its name was Tylos. It was large and most of it neither rugged nor woody, but suitable for producing cultivated fruits and all things in due season. Some of this information was imparted to Alexander by Archias, who was sent with a triacontor to investigate the course of the coasting voyage to Arabia, and who went as far as the island of Tylos, but durst not pass beyond that point. Androsthenes was dispatched with another triacontor and sailed to a part of the peninsula of Arabia. Hieron of Soli, the pilot, also received a triacontor from Alexander and advanced farthest of those whom he dispatched to this region. For he had received instructions to sail round the whole Arabian peninsula as far as the Arabian Gulf near Egypt over against Hierapolis. Although he coasted along the country of the Arabs to a great distance, he durst not go as far as he was ordered. But returning to Alexander, he reported that the size of the peninsula was marvelous, being only a little smaller than the country of the Indians, and its extremity projected far into the great sea. Nearchus, indeed, in his voyage from India had seen this stretching out a little, before he turned aside into the Persian Gulf, and he was almost induced to cross over to it. The pilot Onesicritus thought they ought to have gone thither, but Nearchus says that he himself prevented it, so that after sailing right round the Persian Gulf, he might be able to give a report to Alexander that he had accomplished the voyage on which he had sent him. For Nearchus said he had not been dispatched to navigate the great sea, but to explore the land bordering on the sea, to find out what men inhabit it, to discover the harbors and rivers in it, to ascertain the customs of the people, and to see if any of the country was fertile and if any was sterile. This was the reason why Alexander's naval expedition returned in safety, for if it had sailed beyond the deserts of Arabia, it would not have returned in safety. This is said also to have been the reason why Hieron turned back. Chapter 21. Description of the Euphrates and the Palacopas. While the triremes were being built for him, and the harbor near Babylon was being excavated, Alexander sailed from Babylon down the Euphrates to what was called the river Palacopas, which is distant from Babylon about 800 stads. This Palacopas is not a river rising from springs, but a canal cut from the Euphrates. For that river flowing from the Armenian mountains proceeds within its banks in the season of winter, because its water is scanty. But when the spring begins to make its appearance, and especially just before the summer solstice, it pours along with mighty stream and overflows its banks into the Assyrian country. For at that season the snow upon the Armenian mountains melts and swells its water to a great degree. And as its stream flows high above the level of the country, it would flow over the land if someone had not furnished it with an outlet along the Palacopas and turned it aside into the marshes and pools, which, beginning from this canal, extend as far as the country contiguous to Arabia. Thence it spreads out far and wide into a shallow lake, from which it falls into the sea by many invisible mouths. After the snow has melted, about the time of the setting of the Pleiades, the Euphrates flows with a small stream, but none the less the greater part of it discharges itself into the pools along the Palacopas. Unless, therefore, someone had dammed up the Palacopas again, so that the water might be turned back within the banks and carried down the channel of the river, it would have drained the Euphrates into itself, and consequently the Assyrian country would not be watered by it. But the outlet of the Euphrates into the Palacopas was dammed up by the viceroy of Babylonia with great labor, although it was an easy matter to construct the outlet, because the ground in this region is slimy and most of it mud, so that when it has once received the water of the river, it is not easy to turn it back. But more than 10,000 Assyrians were engaged in this labor even until the third month. When Alexander was informed of this, he was induced to confer a benefit upon the land of Assyria. He determined to shut up the outlet where the stream of the Euphrates was turned into the Palacopas. When he had advanced about 30 stads, the earth appeared to be somewhat rocky, so that if it were cut through and a junction made with the old canal along the Palacopas, on account of the hardness of the soil, it would not allow the water to percolate, and there would be no difficulty in turning it back at the appointed season. For this purpose, he sailed to the Palacopas, and then continued his voyage down that canal into the pools towards the country of the Arabs. There seeing a certain admirable site, he founded a city upon it and fortified it. In it, he settled as many of the Grecian mercenaries as volunteered to remain, and such as were unfit for military service by reason of age or wounds. Chapter 22. An omen of Alexander's approaching death. Having thus proved the falsity of the prophecy of the Chaldeans, by not having experienced any unpleasant fortune in Babylon, as they had predicted, but having marched out of that city without suffering any mishap, he grew confident in spirit and sailed again through the marshes, having Babylon on his left hand. Here a part of his fleet lost its way in the narrow branches of the river through want of a pilot, until he sent a man to pilot it and lead it back into the channel of the river. The following story is told. Most of the tombs of the Assyrian kings had been built among the pools and marshes. When Alexander was sailing through these marshes, and, as the story goes, was himself steering the trireme, a strong gust of wind fell upon his broad-brimmed Macedonian hat and the fillet which encircled it. The hat, being heavy, fell into the water, but the fillet, being carried along by the wind, was caught by one of the reeds growing near the tomb of one of the ancient kings. This incident itself was an omen of what was about to occur, and so was the fact that one of the sailors swam off towards the fillet and snatched it from the reed. But he did not carry it in his hands, because it would have been wetted while he was swimming. He therefore put it round his own head and thus conveyed it to the king. Most of the biographers of Alexander say that the king presented him with a talent as a reward for his zeal, and then ordered his head to be cut off, as the prophets had directed him not to permit that head to be safe which had worn the royal fillet. However, Aristobulus says that the man received a talent, but afterwards also received a scourging for placing the fillet round his head. The same author says that it was one of the Phoenician sailors who fetched the fillet for Alexander, but there are some who say it was Seleucus, and that this was an omen to Alexander of his death and to Seleucus of his great kingdom. For that of all those who succeeded to the sovereignty after Alexander, Seleucus became the greatest king, was the most kingly in mind, and ruled over the greatest extent of land after Alexander himself, does not seem to me to admit of question. Chapter 23. The army recruited from the Persians, Hephaestion's memory honored. When he returned to Babylon, he found that Pusestas had arrived from Persis, bringing with him 20,000 Persians, as well as many Cassians and Tapurians, because these races were reported to be the most warlike of those bordering on Persis. Philoxenus also came to him, bringing an army from Caria, Menander, with another from Lydia, and Menidas with the cavalry which had been put under his command. At the same time arrived embassies from Greece, the members of which, with crowns upon their own heads, approached Alexander and crowned him with golden crowns, as if forsooth they came to him as special envoys deputed to pay him divine honors, and his end was not far off. Then he commended the Persians for their great zeal towards him, which was shown by their obedience to Pusestas in all things, and Pusestas himself for the prudence which he had displayed in ruling them. He distributed these foreign soldiers among the Macedonian ranks in the following way. Each company was led by a Macedonian decurion, and next to him was a Macedonian receiving double pay for distinguished valor. And then came one who received 10 staters, who was so named from the pay he received, being less than that received by the man with double pay, but more than that of the men who were serving as soldiers without holding a position of honor. Next to these came 12 Persians, and last in the company another Macedonian, who also received the pay of 10 staters, so that in each company there were 12 Persians and 4 Macedonians, 3 of whom received higher pay, and the 4th was in command of the company. The Macedonians were armed in their hereditary manner, but of the Persians some were archers, while others had javelins furnished with straps, by which they were held. At this time, Alexander often reviewed his fleet, had many sham fights with his triremes and quadriremes in the river, and contests both for rowers and pilots, the winners receiving crowns. Now arrived the special envoys whom he had dispatched to Ammon to inquire how it was lawful for him to honor Hephaestion. They told him that Ammon said it was lawful to offer sacrifice to him as to a hero. Rejoicing at the response of the oracle, he paid respect to him as a hero from that time. He also dispatched a letter to Cleomenes, who was a bad man and had committed many acts of injustice in Egypt. For my own part, do not blame him for his friendship to Hephaestion and for his recollection of him even when dead. But I do blame him for many other acts. For the letter commanded Cleomenes to prepare chapels for the hero Hephaestion in the Egyptian Alexandria, one in the city itself and another in the island of Pharos, where the tower is situated. The chapels were to be exceedingly large and to be built at lavish expense. The letter also directed that Cleomenes should take care that Hephaestion's name should be attached to them, and moreover that his name should be engraved on all the legal documents with which the merchants entered into bargains with each other. These things I cannot blame, except that he made so much ado about matters of trifling moment. But the following I must blame severely. If I find, said the letter, the temples and chapels of the hero Hephaestion in Egypt well completed, I will not only pardon you any crimes you may have committed in the past, but in the future you shall suffer no unpleasant treatment from me, however great may be the crimes you have committed. I cannot commend this message sent from a great king to a man who was ruling a large country and many people, especially as the man was a wicked one. Chapter 24. Another omen of Alexander's death. But Alexander's own end was now near. Aristobulus says that the following occurrence was a prognostication of what was about to happen. He was distributing the army which came with Peucestes from Persia, and that which came with Philoxenus and Menander from the sea, among the Macedonian lines, and becoming thirsty he retired from his seat, and thus left the royal throne empty. On each side of the throne were couches with silver feet, upon which his personal companions were sitting. A certain man of obscure condition, some say that he was even one of the men kept under guard without being in chains, seeing the throne and the couches empty, and the eunuchs standing round the throne, for the companions also rose up from their seats with the king when he retired, walked through the line of eunuchs, ascended the throne, and sat down upon it. According to Persian law, they did not make him rise from the throne, but rent their garments and beat their breasts and faces as if on account of a great evil. When Alexander was informed of this, he ordered the man who had sat upon his throne to be put to the torture, with the view of discovering whether he had done this according to a plan concerted by a conspiracy. But the man confessed nothing, except that it came into his mind at the time to act thus. Even more for this reason, the diviners explained that this occurrence boded no good to him. A few days after this, after offering to the gods the customary sacrifices for good success, and certain others also for the purpose of divination, he was feasting with his friends, and was drinking far into the night. He is also said to have distributed the sacrificial victims as well as a quantity of wine to the army throughout the companies and centuries. There are some who have recorded that he wished to retire after the drinking party to his bedchamber. But Medius, at that time the most influential of the companions, met him and begged him to join a party of revelers at his residence, saying that the revel would be a pleasant one. Chapter 25. Alexander seized with fever. The royal diary gives the following account, to the effect that he reveled and drank at the dwelling of Medius, then rose up, took a bath, and slept, then again supped at the house of Medius and again drank till far into the night. After retiring from the drinking party, he took a bath, after which he took a little food and slept there, because he already felt feverish. He was carried out upon a couch to the sacrifices, in order that he might offer them according to his daily custom. After performing the sacred rites, he lay down in the banqueting hall until dusk. In the meantime, he gave instructions to the officers about the expedition and voyage, ordering those who were going on foot to be ready on the 4th day, and those who were going to sail with him to be ready to sail on the 5th day. From this place, he was carried upon the couch to the river, where he embarked in a boat and sailed across the river to the park. There he again took a bath and went to rest. On the following day he took another bath and offered the customary sacrifices. He then entered a tester bed, lay down, and chatted with Medius. He also ordered his officers to meet him at daybreak. Having done this, he ate a little supper and was again conveyed into the tester bed. The fever now raged the whole night without intermission. The next day he took a bath, after which he offered sacrifice and gave orders to Nearchus and the other officers that the voyage should begin on the third day. The next day he bathed again and offered the prescribed sacrifices. After performing the sacred rites, he did not yet cease to suffer from the fever. Notwithstanding this, he summoned the officers and gave them instructions to have all things ready for the starting of the fleet. In the evening he took a bath, after which he was very ill. The next day he was transferred to the house near the swimming bath, where he offered the prescribed sacrifices. Though he was now very dangerously ill, he summoned the most responsible of his officers and gave them fresh instructions about the voyage. On the following day he was with difficulty carried out to the sacrifices, which he offered, and none the less gave other orders to the officers about the voyage. The next day, though he was now very ill, he offered the prescribed sacrifices. He now gave orders that the generals should remain in attendance in the hall, and that the colonels and captains should remain before the gates. But being now altogether in a dangerous state, he was conveyed from the park into the palace. When his officers entered the room, he knew them indeed, but could no longer utter a word, being speechless. During the ensuing night and day, and the next night and day, he was in a very high fever. Chapter 26. Alexander's death. Such is the account given in the royal diary. In addition to this, it states that the soldiers were very desirous of seeing him. Some, in order to see him once more while still alive. Others, because there was a report that he was already dead, imagined that his death was being concealed by the confidential bodyguards, as I for my part suppose. Most of them, through grief and affection for their king, forced their way in to see him. It is said that when his soldiers passed by him, he was unable to speak. Yet he greeted each of them with his right hand, raising his head with difficulty and making a sign with his eyes. The royal diary also says that Python, Attalus, Demophon, and Pusestas, as well as Cleomenes, Menidas, and Seleucus, slept in the temple of Serapis, and asked the god whether it would be better and more desirable for Alexander to be carried into his temple, in order as a suppliant to be cured by him. A voice issued from the god saying that he was not to be carried into the temple, but that it would be better for him to remain where he was. This answer was reported by the companions, and soon after Alexander died, as if forsooth this were now the better thing. Neither Aristobulus nor Ptolemy has given an account differing much from the preceding. Some authors, however, have related that his companions asked him to whom he left his kingdom, and that he replied, "To the best." Others say that in addition to this remark, he told them that he saw there would be a great funeral contest held in his honor. Chapter 27. Rumor that Alexander was poisoned. I am aware that many other particulars have been related by historians concerning Alexander's death, and especially that poison was sent for him by Antipater, from the effects of which he died. It is also asserted that the poison was procured for Antipater by Aristotle, who was now afraid of Alexander on account of Callisthenes. It is said to have been conveyed by Cassander, the son of Antipater, some recording that he conveyed it in the hoof of a mule, and that his younger brother Iolaus gave it to the king. For this man was the royal cupbearer, and he happened to have received some affront from Alexander a short time before his death. Others have stated that Medius, being a lover of Iolaus, took part in the deed, for he it was who induced the king to hold the revel. They say that Alexander was seized with an acute paroxysm of pain over the wine cup, on feeling which he retired from the drinking bout. One writer has not even been ashamed to record that, when Alexander perceived he was unlikely to survive, he was going out to throw himself into the river Euphrates, so that he might disappear from men's sight, and leave among the men of aftertimes a more firmly rooted opinion that he owed his birth to a god, and had departed to the gods. But as he was going out, he did not escape the notice of his wife Roxana, who restrained him from carrying out his design. Whereupon he uttered lamentations, saying that she forsooth envied him the complete glory of being thought the offspring of the god. These statements I have recorded rather that I may not seem to be ignorant that they have been made, than because I consider them worthy of credence or even of narration. Chapter 28. Character of Alexander. Alexander died in the 114th Olympiad in the archonship of Hegesias at Athens. According to the statement of Aristobulus, he lived 32 years and had reached the 8th month of his 33rd year. He had reigned 12 years and these 8 months. He was very handsome in person and much devoted to exertion, very active in mind, very heroic in courage, very tenacious of honor, exceedingly fond of incurring danger, and strictly observant of his duty to the gods. In regard to the pleasures of the body, he had perfect self-control, and of those of the mind, praise was the only one of which he was insatiable. He was very clever in recognizing what was necessary to be done, even when it was still a matter unnoticed by others, and very successful in conjecturing from the observation of facts what was likely to occur. In marshalling, arming, and ruling an army, he was exceedingly skillful, and very renowned for rousing the courage of his soldiers, filling them with hopes of success, and dispelling their fear in the midst of danger by his own freedom from fear. Therefore, even what he had to do in secret, he did with the greatest boldness. He was also very clever in getting the start of his enemies, and snatching from them their advantages by secretly forestalling them, before anyone even feared what was about to happen. He was likewise very steadfast in keeping the agreements and settlements which he made, as well as very secure from being entrapped by deceivers. Finally, he was very sparing in the expenditure of money for the gratification of his own pleasures, but he was exceedingly bountiful in spending it for the benefit of his associates. Chapter 29. Apology for Alexander's errors. That Alexander should have committed errors in his conduct from quickness of temper or from wrath, and that he should have been induced to comport himself like the Persian monarchs to an immoderate degree, I do not think remarkable if we fairly consider both his youth and his uninterrupted career of good fortune. Likewise, that kings have no associates in pleasure who aim at their best interests, but that they will always have associates urging them to do wrong. However, I am certain that Alexander was the only one of the ancient kings who, from nobility of character, repented of the errors which he had committed. The majority of men, even if they have become conscious that they have committed an error, make the mistake of thinking that they can conceal their sin by defending their error as if it had been a just action. But it seems to me that the only cure for sin is for the sinner to confess it, and to be visibly repentant in regard to it. Thus the suffering will not appear altogether intolerable to those who have undergone unpleasant treatment, if the person who inflicted it confesses that he has acted dishonorably. And this good hope for the future is left to the man himself, that he will never again commit a similar sin if he is seen to be vexed at his former errors. I do not think that even his tracing his origin to a god was a great error on Alexander's part, if it was not perhaps merely a device to induce his subjects to show him reverence. Nor does he seem to me to have been a less renowned king than Minos, Aeacus, or Rhadamanthus, to whom no insolence is attributed by the men of old, because they trace their origin to Zeus. Nor does he seem at all inferior to Theseus or Ion, the former being the reputed son of Poseidon, and the latter of Apollo. His adoption of the Persian mode of dressing also seems to me to have been a political device in regard to the foreigners, that the king might not appear altogether an alien to them, and in regard to the Macedonians, to show them that he had a refuge from their rashness of temper and insolence. For this reason, I think, he mixed the Persian royal guards, who carried golden apples at the end of their spears, among the ranks of the Macedonians, and the Persian peers with the Macedonian bodyguards. Aristobulus also asserts that Alexander used to have long drinking parties, not for the purpose of enjoying the wine, as he was not a great wine drinker, but in order to exhibit his sociality and friendly feeling to his companions. Chapter 30. Eulogy of Alexander. Whoever therefore reproaches Alexander as a bad man, let him do so. But let him first not only bring before his mind all his actions deserving reproach, but also gather into one view all his deeds of every kind. Then indeed let him reflect who he is himself, and what kind of fortune he has experienced, and then consider who that man was whom he reproaches as bad, and to what a height of human success he attained, becoming without any dispute king of both continents, and reaching every place by his fame, while he himself who reproaches him is of smaller account, spending his labor on petty objects, which, however, he does not succeed in effecting, petty as they are. For my own part, I think there was at that time no race of men, no city, nor even a single individual to whom Alexander's name and fame had not penetrated. For this reason, it seems to me that a hero totally unlike any other human being could not have been born without the agency of the deity. And this is said to have been revealed after Alexander's death by the oracular responses, by the visions which presented themselves to various people, and by the dreams which were seen by different individuals. It is also shown by the honor paid to him by men up to the present time, and by the recollection which is still held of him as more than human. Even at the present time, after so long an interval, other oracular responses in his honor have been received by the nation of the Macedonians. In relating the history of Alexander's achievements, there are some things which I have been compelled to censure, but I am not ashamed to admire Alexander himself. Those actions I have branded as bad, both from a regard to my own veracity and at the same time for the benefit of mankind. For this reason, I think that I undertook the task of writing this history not without the divine inspiration. The end of the history of Alexander's deeds. Footnotes: